On a dark, moonless night in the year of our Lord, 1314, Thomas Randolph, the young Earl of Moray, gathered a small band of warriors round him. They were about to embark on a daring attempt to scale the sheer rock face of Edinburgh Castle and take the garrison by surprise. The second last castle, still in English hands in the whole of Scotland, was about to fall into the hands of the Scots. The long war of Scottish independence was approaching its immortal climax. It was a bleak and stormy day in March 1286, when Alexander III, King of Scots, presided over what was to be the last meeting of his council. They met high above Edinburgh, in the Castle of the Maidens. Little of importance was discussed, and afterwards, ignoring the foul weather and the advice of his companions, he insisted on rejoining his queen at Kingaun, on the other side of the Forth. Alexander crossed the river safely by the Queen's Ferry. But in the rain and in the darkness, he somehow became separated from his guides. Next morning, he was found on the beach with his neck broken. The stage was now set for a bitter struggle, which was to culminate some 28 years later on the marshy banks of a small stream winding its way below Stirling Castle, the Bannockburn. King Alexander left no sons to succeed him. His only heir was his granddaughter, a young Norwegian princess, and when she died in Orkney 4 years later, Scotland was faced with the bleak prospect of civil war over the complicated rights of succession to the throne. Anxious to avoid this, the guardians appointed to rule the country turned to Edward I, King of England, and asked him to decide which of the various contenders ought to be offered the empty throne. King Edward, who had briefly been Alexander's brother-in-law, was only too happy to oblige, but insisted that in return the Scots should acknowledge him as Scotland's overlord. All of the claimants to the throne were men of Norman French descent, who had married into the old Celtic aristocracy. They also held lands in England, and 3 of them, Balliol, Bruce, and Cumming, had actually fought for Edward's father, King Henry III, at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. As a result, Edward was able to argue quite persuasively that since they were already his subjects anyway, he was entitled to treat Scotland as a province of England rather than an independent state. In the circumstances, the guardians felt that they had little choice but to agree. And over the next 18 months, the original 13 claimants, or competitors, were whittled down to just 2. John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, and Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. Balliol won the favour of nobility and became King John of Scotland.
There aren't many sources for Bannockburn, of course, it was a long time ago, but of those which do survive, 2 in particular are quite important. One, the Lanercost Chronicle, written by an Augustinian friar at Lanercost Priory near Carlisle, tells the story very vividly from the English point of view. He himself saw many of the events in the story, and he obviously talked to a number of people because all the way through he comes out with the phrase, "I heard this from someone who was there," and it's a very vivid account. On the other hand, on the Scots side, probably the most important source is the Bruce, a long poem by another monk, everybody in those days who could read and write was a monk, called John Barber, who came from Aberdeen, and wrote a very long metrical account of the Wars of Independence, dealing with Bruce and also very skillfully weaving in a lot of stories about the Douglas family, who were also rather important at the time. Whether they were quite so important in the War of Independence, we don't know, but certainly it was politically astute of him to work in the Douglases. Some of the stories he tells are very legendary. The Bruce killed quite a number of people in most remarkable fashion, and so did his Peyton Douglas. But again, it does provide a very important story. It's an oral tradition, and a lot of the story, a lot of the detail would be lost without it.
History Hit is an award-winning streaming platform built by history fans for history fans. Enjoy our rich library of documentaries covering key events and locations of the medieval period. History Hit's medieval offering features leading historians such as Dan Jones, Eleanor Janega and Kat Jarman. Not only that, but we've a rich library of audio documentaries covering every period of history through our network of podcasts. Sign up now for a free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
An Augustinian canon at Lanercost Priory recorded the result with some satisfaction.
On the feast of Blessed John the Baptist, it was determined John de Balliol had the better right to the kingdom of Scotland, and that it fell to him by right. When he heard this, my Lord Edward, with the consent of the nobles and of the majority of the deputies, conferred the kingdom of Scotland upon John de Balliol, who did homage for it. In the same year, after Easter, Edward, King of England, called a parliament at Norham in the 19th year of his reign, concerning the affairs of the realm of Scotland, where the suzerainty of Scotland was adjudged to him and conceded unanimously by the nobles of the aforesaid realm, having first touched the sacred Gospels.
At first all went well, and the English overlordship looked as if it would endure. But in 1294, Edward ordered King John to raise an army to fight in English service in France. This peremptory demand was refused, both by Edward's own English vassals and by the Scots. The king was perfectly entitled, they said, to demand men for the defence of the realm, but he had no right to demand them for service overseas. The issue itself was not a matter of sovereignty, but the Scots transformed it into one, when the previously subservient King John of Scotland signed an alliance with France and sent troops to raid the north of England. Edward was, of course, furious, and his response was vicious. In 17 bloody days during 1296, he stormed and sacked Berwick, defeated the Scots army at Dunbar, and forced a humiliated King John to sue for peace. Edward treated the Scots not as legitimate enemies, but as rebels in arms to be shown no mercy. His barbarous treatment of the defeated Scots kindled the flames of resentment. In the following year, the Scots responded with a national uprising. Sir Andrew Murray raised the north and, moving southwards, linked up with another Scots army led by a fearsome warrior named William Wallace. On the 11th of September 1297, the combined army inflicted a terrible defeat on the English at Stirling Bridge. The Lanercost chronicler recorded his horror at what had happened.
Not daring to openly break their pledged faith to the King of England, some of the Scots caused a certain bloody man, William Wallace, who had formerly been a chief of brigands in Scotland, to revolt against the king and assemble the people in his support. So, about the nativity of the glorious Virgin, they showed themselves in rebellion, and when a great army of England came, they were brought to the bridge of Stirling, where, on the other side of the water, the army of Scotland was posted. Now, the Scots allowed as many of the English to cross the bridge as they could hope to overcome, and then, having blocked the bridge, they slaughtered all those who had crossed, amongst whom perished the treasurer of England, Hugh de Cressingham, of whose skin William Wallace caused a broad strip to be torn from the head to heel, to therewith make a baldric for his sword. The Earl of Warren escaped with great difficulty and a small following, so hotly did the enemy pursue them.
Unfortunately for the Scots cause, Sir Andrew Murray was fatally wounded in the battle at Stirling. But Wallace still carried the torch and harried the north of England, bringing fire and destruction to the land of his sworn enemy. At the time of the Wallace incursion, Edward was busy campaigning in Gascony, but as soon as he was able, he hastily returned and marched north with a strong army. Edward smashed the Scots army at Falkirk in July 1298. Thereafter, the struggle became a vicious guerrilla war, marked by appalling atrocities on both sides. Wallace himself was finally captured and executed in 1305. But by then, the Scots had found new leaders, most notably Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, a grandson of the Robert the Bruce who had unsuccessfully offered himself as a candidate for the crown in 1291. Although they shared the same name, grandfather and grandson are seldom confused. The man who was to become Scotland's greatest warrior king is known to history simply as the Bruce. For all that, his loyalties were at first rather uncertain. He had fought in the Scottish cause alongside Murray and Wallace at Stirling Bridge in 1297. But, in keeping with the complicated pattern of shifting allegiance which characterised the medieval era, he changed sides and served under King Edward on the side of the English at the Battle of Falkirk the following year. In fact, Bruce was still fighting for the English when they took Stirling Castle in 1305, but by then his father was dead and he had inherited his grandfather's claim to the throne of Scotland. Even as he fought for his English overlords, it is likely that he was already plotting to overcome them.
The question of allegiance in the medieval period was extremely pragmatic, just as it is today. It was really a question of grab what, who can. Now, a king, once he was crowned, that was one thing. But for him to be able to retain the crown, that was altogether another, because his tenants-in-chief would never regard him as anything more than primus inter pares, the first amongst equals. So in sum, it was a question of each for himself. In 1302, Bruce got wind of an alliance between John of Balliol and Philip the Fair of France. Now, this created the very real possibility of a French military intervention in Scottish affairs. In that case, Bruce became aware all his possessions would be in peril. It therefore very much behoved him to change his allegiance at this point, and he duly did.
At the beginning of 1306, Bruce changed sides for the last time. The vacant throne of Scotland was now his overriding goal. To this end, he murdered John Comyn, his nearest remaining rival for the throne of Scotland. So bitter was the feud between Bruce and his rival that the only place where they both felt they could meet safely was in church. Ostensibly drawn together to discuss a truce, they met near Dumfries in a chapel. Despite this sacred meeting place, Bruce unsheathed his dagger and murdered Comyn in cold blood. Bruce was excommunicated for this act. Nonetheless, he had himself crowned King of Scots at Scone on Palm Sunday. Edward's reaction to these events was predictable. Too ill for campaigning himself, he dispatched an army northwards which caught Bruce unawares outside Perth and scattered his men with a single cavalry charge. Even in the face of this reverse, Bruce was still undaunted, and he took to the hills with a few followers. But a year later, he was sufficiently strong to come back at the head of a small army and defeat the English at the Battle of Loudon Hill near Kilmarnock. In the face of this continued insolence, Edward at last resolved to deal with the Bruce himself. But at 68, he was far too old and worn out. Much against the advice of his household, Edward raised his army and once again marched north. He died at Burgh-on-Sands, 3 miles short of the border with Scotland, and the invasion was abandoned.
Edward I was a really difficult person to follow. Not only was he a very experienced soldier, the Hammer of the Scots, of course, as his nickname was, he was also a great statesman, and important developments took place during his reign in England. He was, above all, though, an experienced soldier. He had dealt with civil war in England, he'd been on a crusade, he'd defeated and conquered the Welsh. He had almost knocked out Scotland in an earlier campaign, and it was only really in his later years, as he became older and iller, that things began to slip just a bit. But you can criticise him for not really bringing on the first Prince of Wales, of course, as Edward II had been, properly. He did not bring him up properly. And I think part of the responsibility, therefore, for Edward II's weaknesses lie upon the head of his father. Edward II has really received a very bad press, both in his own time and subsequently. And this is not, in fact, entirely fair. Although we must admit he had his favourites, Piers Gaveston and others, and people who questioned his sexual mores, at the same time he was an extremely cultivated king, enjoying art and music and painting. In many ways he was way ahead of his time. But the trouble was he was not really tough enough to be a king in this particular century.
Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, was dead, and the war entered a new phase. By his murder of John Cumming, Bruce had removed a potential rival. But in so doing, he had embroiled himself in desperate blood feud with the rest of the Cummings. Resistance to English rule had begun in the north of Scotland, and it was ironic that Bruce now had to fight against those same northern lords who had fought to establish the country's independence. Bruce defeated the Earl of Buchan at Barra near Aberdeen in December 1307. The harrying of the province of Buchan which followed this victory was still remembered with horror 50 years afterwards, but it served its purpose. Slowly but surely the Bruce tightened his grip on Scotland, and by the summer of 1314 he was no longer a hunted fugitive, but undeniably King of Scots. One by one the towns and castles of Scotland had fallen, or thrown open their gates to his men. Now only one remained in English hands, and that the most important, Stirling Castle, the key to the kingdom. Although not so large as Edinburgh Castle, Stirling was strategically far more important since it dominated the central plain in the middle of Scotland, where most of the wealth and population concentrated. Today, it is still a majestic and awe-inspiring sight. In the Middle Ages, it was a daunting fortress. For the Scots, the capture of Stirling Castle was vital, but Edward's successor, the new king, Edward II, was equally alive to its importance. Unlike his terrifying father, Edward II was no soldier. Nevertheless, even he recognised that if Stirling Castle fell back into the hands of the Scots, the war was effectively lost. King Edward was determined to relieve the beleaguered English garrison. Following in the footsteps of his father, he too gathered an army about him and marched north in the momentous year 1314. He was spurred on by the disturbing news that the governor of the castle, Sir Philip Mowbray, had agreed to surrender to the Scots if he was not relieved by Midsummer's Day. Edward's march therefore became both a show of strength and a race against time. Both sides were only too well aware of the importance of the coming encounter. The long, drawn-out struggle was about to be decided one way or another in a final climactic battle. King Edward's army at Bannockburn was raised by various means. At its heart were its household knights, a contingent of armoured cavalrymen permanently employed by him. These professional soldiers were joined by the lesser retinues of various lords, some of whom were mercenaries like themselves, while others were vassals performing the 40 days' service demanded of them by feudal law. In all, Edward mustered something like 3,000 heavy cavalry. Not all of them were knights, of course. Some were ordinary men-at-arms, but by comparison to the Scots, they were very well equipped. Nearly all wore iron helmets and mail coats, supplemented by various types of plate armour. Chainmail will give good protection against sword cuts, but is of little defence against heavy, crushing blows. So while most knights were armed with swords and lances, quite a few preferred battle axes and heavy flanged maces. Accompanying the new king were 20,000 infantrymen. Many of these were raised from the Welsh marches, but the Irish Prince of Connaught was also requested to provide Irish spearmen to serve in the army. The balance of the infantry came in part from the feudal retinues of various noblemen, but most of the foot soldiers were assembled by means of commissions of array. These were summons issued to county sheriffs and to other local leaders, instructing them to levy a certain number of fully equipped foot soldiers from their shires. The task of actually selecting the men who were to go on service was generally delegated by the sheriffs to the village communities themselves. They were simply given a quota of recruits to fill and were then left to produce the required number. All yeomen with lands or rents worth £2 to £5 a year were liable to serve as archers, and naturally the quality of the fighting men varied enormously. Landless labourers were not liable for military service, but they could be hired as substitutes to go in place of yeomen who were chosen to go but wished to stay at home. The local communities were also responsible for arming and clothing the men chosen to go, and it seems to have been customary at this time for them to have been given white woolen coats, as well as knives, swords, and bows or spears. Once they had been mustered for service, the foot soldiers were organised into units of 20 men, led by an officer called vintenard, from the French word meaning 20. 5 of these units, or vingtaines, were grouped together in a company, led by a centenar. He rode on horseback, wearing full armour, and was often a professional soldier, though like the vintenard, he might sometimes be elected by his men. There was no formal organisation above the level of the company, although men from the same country or from a particular nobleman's estates did tend to serve together. Come the day of the battle, it was customary to organise the various companies into 3 great divisions, or battles: the vanward, the mainward, and the rearward. It was the job of the marshal, the medieval equivalent of a chief of staff, to allocate the different companies to each division in such a way as to ensure that all 3 had an even proportion of archers and spearmen. The infantry were, of course, much less heavily armed and equipped than the cavalry. Over their basic clothing of shirt, hose, and doublet, foot soldiers commonly wore padded quilted jackets of canvas or leather, and perhaps some mail as well, together with simple iron helmets. If they belonged to a lord's retinue or were in direct pay of the king, they would also wear livery coats, displaying their master's badge, but otherwise plain white coats. Often a red cross of St. George was added to the coats of the infantry. Most of King Edward's infantry at Bannockburn were archers, but there were also spearmen amongst the county levies, and other spearmen and crossbowmen were raised in Wales and in Ireland. The Scots army was raised in a somewhat similar fashion, but in a crucial respect it was very different from the English one. The most important element of the Scots army was not the mounted knights, but the infantry. They were chiefly armed with long pikes. In Scotland, only men of property were seriously considered for the army. It was felt that only those who had possessed a stake in the land could be entrusted to defend it, and in any case a certain amount of wealth was required in order to be able to afford the necessary equipment. Although the Scots infantry were mainly conscripts, they were not the tattered peasant levies of popular imagination. Once the men had been selected and their equipment inspected at Wappenshaws, or weapon showings, they were formed into companies which might be led by local lairds, or in the case of the men from the boroughs, by the bailies or even by the provost himself. Unlike the English foot soldiers, who fought principally using the bill and bow, the Scots relied upon large bodies of pikemen, who were grouped together to form schiltrons, a Scots term which quite literally means moving thickets. Each of these moving hedgehogs of pikes was about 3,000 strong. The men were densely packed shoulder to shoulder, forming a forest of spear points, which posed a formidable obstacle to charging cavalry. It did, however, make them very vulnerable to archery, the one arm in which England led the world. As the Scots had found to their cost at Dunbar, and were to do again at Neville's Cross, the English longbowmen were deadly foes if the opportunity presented itself. If the Scots spearmen were left unprotected, the devastating arrow showers from the fearsome English longbows fell upon tightly packed spearmen where they could hardly fail to find a target, bringing death before the Scots even had a chance to come to grips with the enemy. Despite this glaring tactical weakness, the Scots nobles shared the dangers with the men. While the English leaders rode with the cavalry, the Scots knights dismounted and fought in the front ranks of the schiltrons, shoulder to shoulder with their men. Many of the Scots officers were as well armoured as their English counterparts, but since they were serving on foot rather than on horseback, some of them relied on padded jackets and simple iron helmets like their men. Weapon shows were held not only to check that each man possessed the weapons and equipment required of him by law, but also to provide an opportunity for training, which meant that the Scots infantry of the period was much better disciplined and drilled than many of their contemporaries. Throughout the period, however, the Scots were inferior in archers, and they were therefore always vulnerable to the mighty longbow.
The schiltron was an old and well-tested method of fighting the Scots. What was different about Bannockburn was that, unlike many battles in which the Scots were involved, they had time to practice. Any fool can learn what to do with a pike in a very short time, but it takes a long time and a great deal of practice to be able to move properly, move swiftly and move efficiently in a large body. Very often the Scots armies couldn't manage that, so the sheer distance they had to travel to actually meet anybody. At Bannockburn, on the other hand, they had a long time to wait for the English to come. They knew the English were coming to Stirling, so they had time while they waited to actually practice moving in large bodies. In fact, it's not impossible that they actually rehearsed part of the battle on the castle below Stirling Castle, so that on the day of the battle they were not only used to moving in large formation, but they were actually used to moving over the very ground in which the battle was fought.
A medieval knight was of course trained from boyhood to use his personal weapons, and the fearsome charge of a body of mounted knights was the greatest shock tactic of the age. But little effort or thought was given to training large bodies of cavalry to fight together. Time and time again at Bannockburn, individual English knights were to charge bravely against the disciplined ranks of Scots pikemen, only to find that their courage and individual battle skills were not enough.
There's nothing very new about the idea of the schiltron as such. Indeed, the very year after the Battle of Bannockburn, speaking of the year 1315, at Mortgarten, the Swiss produced a very much larger form of the schiltron, using in fact 21-foot pikes, whereas those we know of Robert the Bruce were about 14 feet in length. And even then it was not a new invention, of course. Right back in classical history, the city-states of Greece, when they were first emerging, used the phalanx, which was, to all intents and purposes, exactly the same as the schiltron of later times.
King Edward ordered his army to assemble at Berwick on the 10th of June 1314. And travelling north by way of Edinburgh, he reached Falkirk in the evening of the 22nd, barely 10 miles from Stirling. The King of Scots was waiting for him. Unlike William Wallace 17 years before, Bruce had chosen his battlefield with some considerable care. Stirling was surrounded by a low flood plain or carse, a wet marshy area unsuitable for cavalrymen. The old Roman road, however, followed a spine of slightly higher dry ground. A couple of miles south of Stirling, the road crossed a narrow stream called the Bannockburn, and then ran over a low plateau with patches of woodland. This area had been reserved by the Scottish kings as a hunting ground and was called the New Park. King Edward would obviously seek to advance on Stirling along the Roman road. He had a huge baggage train, and it could not be dragged across open country. Therefore, Bruce at first deployed his army among the trees of the New Park just north of the ford over the Bannockburn. Pots or pitfalls were dug across the front of this position, so that if they tried to force their way up the road, the English cavalry would not have one, but two difficult obstacles to cross before coming into contact with the Scots infantry. On the other hand, the flat carse to the east of the New Park was left invitingly empty. On Sunday the 23rd, the English army cautiously felt its way forward to the Bannockburn and halted about half a mile to the south of it. At this point, Sir Philip Mowbray, the governor of Stirling, is said to have slipped out and advised King Edward that as far as he was concerned, the castle had now been relieved, and that there was no need for the king to advance any further. Not surprisingly, even King Edward was a little bemused by this extraordinary suggestion, but at least Mowbray confirmed to him that large bodies of Scots infantry had been seen moving amongst the trees of the New Park. Bruce had in fact taken up a position of all-round defence in the park. Edward was advancing along the road from the south, and would soon discover the elaborate and perhaps rather obvious obstacles placed in his path, but there was still a faint possibility that an English frontal assault might be arranged to coincide with a sortie from the castle, or even that the king would make use of considerable superiority in numbers to both attack up the road and swing round into the Carse at the same time. Bruce was ready to fight in any eventuality. Sensibly, however, King Edward began by sending 2 squadrons of cavalry forward to have a look at the new park before committing himself. The first English reconnaissance party, led by Sir Humphrey de Bohun, the impetuous nephew of the Earl of Hereford, advanced straight up the road, splashed across the ford over the Bannockburn, and took note of the defences. Then, to their mutual surprise, they came face to face with the Bruce in person. The King of Scots had ridden out to reconnoitre the terrain. He was quite alone. Young de Bohun acted at once. Couching his lance, he rode straight at the Bruce. Had the Scots king been properly equipped and mounted, he would undoubtedly have responded by accepting the nobleman's challenge and riding at de Bohun in similar style, as if they were in a tournament. Instead, he waited quietly until the English knight was almost upon him, jinked aside on his nimble pony, and killed the unfortunate de Bohun with a single shattering blow from his battle-axe as he thundered past. At this point, some Scots cavalry appeared on the scene and chased off de Bohun's startled followers. But the Bruce's only comment was to complain about the perfectly good battle-axe he had broken in the act of dispatching de Bohun. This stirring incident was captured by the 14th century poet John Barber in his epic poem, The Bruce.
Then sprang they into line, but Sir Henry missed the noble king, and he that in his stirrups stood, wi' an axe that was baith hard and good, with 6 great men stuck amae, dunt that neither hat nor helm micht stint. The heavy blow that him he gave, that he the heat the harness cleft, the hand axe shaft broke in twa, and he down to the earth did fa.
Meanwhile, the second English reconnaissance party, led by Sir Robert de Clifford and Sir Henry de Beaumont, had run into real trouble. Crossing the Bannockburn further to the east, they kept to the open ground and were working their way around to what appeared to be the open flank of the Scots position, when a schiltron of pikemen suddenly rolled out of the woods towards them. As his pikemen came clear of the trees, their leader, the Earl of Moray, halted for a moment in order to give them time to close up their ranks again. At this point, a furious argument broke out between the leaders of the English cavalry. A Yorkshire knight, Sir Thomas Grey, was in favour of charging the Scots at once, while they were still in some disorder, but de Beaumont and some others wanted to wait, confidently insisting that the more men who were allowed to come out of the trees, the more of them would be slain. None of them had any doubts at all that they could overcome a rabble of unarmoured pikemen. Stung by de Beaumont's sneering accusation of cowardice, Grey rushed straight at the Scots and was killed at once by the pikemen. Other English knights soon followed him, but try as they might, they could not break into the serried mass of pikes pressing towards them. In their frustration, some even flung their lances at the Scots, like javelins, but all to no avail. And as the Scots resumed their advance, the English cavalry fled in disorder, some to Stirling, others back to King Edward's camp. Having made their point in no uncertain terms, Murray's pikemen calmly marched back into the shade of the trees. The first round of the battle had undoubtedly gone to the Scots. But King Edward now knew that while a frontal assault straight up the Roman road looked like being rather too difficult, it still appeared to be possible to outflank the Scots' position by following Clifford's route. That night, the whole English army ponderously swung round to its right, struggled across the Bannockburn to the east of the new park, and then waited uncomfortably for dawn. Already the operation was going badly wrong. Clifford's reconnaissance force had quite naturally stuck to the relatively high ground near the park. They reported it to be fairly dry, but an army, and more especially an army of over 20,000 men, needs considerably more space than a mere squadron of cavalry. And in order to find that space, the English host drifted further towards the east and blundered into a great bog. Certainly it would be hard to find a worse position for the English army than the one in which they now found themselves. Not only were they standing up to their ankles in mud and water, but they had a large river at their backs and another stream on their flank across their line of retreat, a most unenviable situation. They had, in fact, walked into a carefully prepared trap. A clear night in midsummer is neither very dark nor very long, but the chroniclers all agree that the English army spent a few miserable hours in that evil, deep, wet marsh, crowded closely together, waiting for sufficient light to see where they were and what they could do about it. The Bruce was, of course, aware of this move almost as soon as it had begun, and while the English unhappily floundered about amidst the mud and stagnant ponds, he swung his own army around and formed 3 of the schiltrons into a line ready to face the English at dawn. His brother, Sir Edward Bruce, commanded the schiltron on his right. Then came Murray's schiltron in the centre, and Sir James Douglas's one on the left. The King's own schiltron formed a reserve. An additional reserve in the form of a division of poorly armed and undisciplined Highlanders, the Gillies, was left hidden in the new park. Unlike the English, the Scots had very few cavalry at Bannockburn. Most of the Scottish knights who were present fought on foot in the front rank of the pikemen. Bruce had in fact only 500 light horsemen, led by Sir Robert Keith. These he placed well out on the left flank of the army, where they could guard against any sortie by the garrison of Stirling Castle. The English dispositions, on the other hand, were very badly thought out. Or perhaps it was more likely that the confusion in the bog had upset any plans which might have been made. There were no recognisable divisions of the army, just 2 long lines, one drawn up behind the other. The front line was composed of 9 squadrons of cavalry, each one about 250 strong. And on the left of the line stood a much larger division of some 800 cavalrymen, rather optimistically called the vanguard. Behind this colourful array of chivalry, the English infantry were drawn up in a single disorderly mass, hemmed in between the Bannockburn and the River Forth. The confusion in which the English found themselves at dawn was further increased by an acrimonious dispute which broke out between the Earls of Hereford and Gloucester, over which of them should command the vanguard. The young Gloucester lost the argument. Churlishly he rode up to the king and advised him to delay the battle for a day, until some more suitable ground could be found. Badly chosen though the ground undoubtedly was, the English army was now committed to battle. It was far too late to think of drawing back, and King Edward angrily accused his nephew of cowardice and treachery. To this charge there could only be one answer. Gloucester at once rejoined his men, and without waiting to don his heraldic surcoat or even to make sure that they were following him, he galloped straight towards the nearest schiltron. Like Sir Thomas Grey the day before, he was virtually committing suicide. His horse was instantly speared from under him, and both he and his standard-bearer were cut down. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Sir William Wallace had formed his schiltrons into defensive hedgehogs, not unlike the famous British squares at Waterloo 500 years later. Once he had done that, he simply stood and waited the onslaught of the cavalry. All the while they were at the mercy of the fearsome English longbow. It was almost as if Wallace sensed the stand would be futile. With a fatalistic resignation, his last words to his army were ominous. "I have brought ye to the ring," he said to his men. "Now dance as ye may." The wily old king, Edward I, had dealt with each schiltron in turn. With calculated ferocity, he first shot great gaps in the densely packed Scottish ranks with his archers, and then he sent in his cavalry to exploit the gaps, where they butchered the survivors. But his son was not the master tactician his father had been, and he was now faced with a far more cunning adversary, the Bruce himself. Bruce's tactics at Bannockburn were very different from those adopted by Wallace. He would not wait to be attacked, but strike first. Before they did so, however, his troops fell to their knees in prayer for safe deliverance in the coming battle.
Now, when the two armies approached very near to each other, the Scots fell to their knees to repeat Pater Noster, commending themselves to God and seeking help from heaven, after which they advanced boldly on the English. They had so arranged their army into 3 columns abreast, so that none of the 3 should advance ahead of the other. The 4th followed behind, in which was the King of Scots. By a truth, when the 2 armies engaged, the great English horses advancing on the pikes of the Scots as in a dense forest, there arose a great and terrible crash of spears broken and destriers wounded to death, and so they remained without movement for a while. The English in the rear could not reach the Scots because the leading division was in the way, nor could they do anything to help themselves. This account I heard from a trustworthy person who was an eyewitness.
Instead of passively standing on the defensive, waiting to be attacked, Bruce formed his schiltrons into columns and began the battle by advancing them down the gentle slope from St Ninian's Kirk and the New Park, down towards the disorderly rabble which was the English army. As battle was joined, the Scots schiltrons advanced against the English cavalry. As they closed together for mutual assistance, it became obvious that they were going to be outflanked on the left, so Bruce led up his own men to prolong the front line. Time and time again, the English cavalry rode boldly forward, vainly flinging themselves against the Scots' pikes. None of them could break through. The Scots stood resolutely, concentrating on killing the horses. As each mailed knight fell or kicked himself clear of his dying horse, he was quickly finished off with swords or axes. John Barbour's epic poem captures something of the atmosphere of this stage of the battle. Bannockburn was no chivalrous encounter conducted between brightly caparisoned knights in a green meadow. It was no elegant tourney fought over the honour of a fair lady, but a muddy, brutal killing match in which no prisoners were taken and fine gentlemen were ruthlessly butchered by common soldiers.
They laid on as men out of wet, for they wi' full stracht might hit, and wi' axes sick blows gid that they helms and heads clave, and the foes recht hardly met them and dang on doutly. With weapons that were strong as steel, there was a battle-stricken wheel. Sae great dinning were their wise at dunce as weapons upon armour stent. And so spears sae great bristling with sic thran and sic thrusting, sic gurning, groaning, sae great a noise as assailed in another, and cried slogans on every side. Ah, it was hideous for to hear them.
Behind the desperately embattled knights, the English infantry at first stood idly by, unable to intervene in the struggle. From time to time, the archers amongst them tried to provide at least some assistance by shooting over the knights' heads in the hope of dropping their shafts in among the closely packed ranks of Scots pikemen on the other side of the melee. Unfortunately, they also succeeded in shooting many of their own men in the back and were soon ordered to stop. Then some other archers, led by professional soldiers, ran out onto the right of the English line, well clear of the fighting. From this vantage point, they were able to shoot the exposed flank of the Bruce's own schiltron without worrying about hitting their own men. As the casualties amongst the pikemen mounted, Bruce called upon his own cavalry. There were 500 of them, not heavily armoured knights, but light horsemen, capable of moving very swiftly. The English archers had no defensive stakes to protect them, or heavy spearmen to back them up, and Sir Robert Keith's charge was completely successful. The archers were quickly scattered and cut down. The threat to the Scots flank had been averted. In the centre, the battle was going equally badly for the English. Even King Edward had to defend himself with his mace, his hands pulled and tugged at his harness. The battle had been raging for an hour now, and at this point there was an unexpected development. Bruce knew that his men would soon be tiring, but being a good general, he had kept his very last reserve for just this moment. Legend has it that the men who now suddenly appeared on the top of Coxet Hill in the New Park were camp followers. A motley and quite harmless collection of grooms, peasants, cooks and sutlers with makeshift banners. In reality, they were actually Highland clansmen or gillies. They lacked the training and discipline necessary to make good pikemen, and because they could not stand up to the English cavalry in the open, Bruce had left them hidden amongst the trees of the New Park. However, now that the knights were fully occupied in fighting the Scots pikemen, the king called the Highlanders forward. Their intervention was decisive. As the clansmen appeared on the hill above the battlefield, Bruce called out to his men, "Upon them! On them recht hardily!" And the final push began. To their dismay, the English knights saw the Scots reinforcements come flooding forward. And then the dismay turned to horror as they realized that the despised foot soldiers were actually driving them backwards, deeper into the bog.
In the leading division were killed the Earl of Gloucester, Sir John Cummings, Sir Pagan de Tiptoft, Sir Edmund de Morley, and many other nobles, besides foot soldiers, who fell in great numbers. Another calamity which befell the English was that whereas earlier they had crossed a great ditch called Bannockburn into which the tide flows, when they tried to recross it in confusion, many of the nobles fell back with their horses in the crush, while others escaped with great difficulty, and many could not extricate themselves from the ditch. Thus was Bannockburn spoken about for many years in English throats.
Not all of the English knights ran away, or even tried to. Sir Giles d'Argentine, an old crusader, fought his way through to King Edward's side, led him safely from the battlefield, and then, declaring, "I have never been accustomed to run," he returned to the fight and certain death. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, had won his battle, but the killing was far from over. It is generally true to say that before the invention of gunpowder, few men were actually killed in battle. The vast majority of those who died were cut down while fleeing after the fighting had ended. This was certainly true at Bannockburn. Although many Scots pikemen were killed, mainly by English arrows, only 2 Scottish knights, Sir William de Vipon and Sir Walter Ross, were slain. As for the defeated English, so many of them were killed in trying to flee back across the Bannockburn that it was said to be possible afterwards to walk dry-shod over the corpses. The relentless pursuit went on till nightfall, which at midsummer came very late in the day. King Edward himself made first for Stirling Castle, the nearest and perhaps most obvious refuge. But the governor was already short of provisions, and pointed out to the king that he would soon be forced to surrender. Eventually, a knight was found who was able to guide King Edward round the back of the victorious Scottish army and then eastwards to Dunbar, where he found a ship to carry him back to England. Others were rather less fortunate, as the Lanarkos chronicler relates.
As the king and his following fled in one direction, so the Earl of Hereford, the Earl of Angus, Sir John de Seagrave, Sir Anthony de Lucy, and Sir Ingram de Umfraville, with a great crowd of knights, 600 other mounted men, and 1,000 foot, fled in another direction towards Carlisle. The Earl of Pembroke left the army on foot and saved himself with the fugitive Welsh. But the aforesaid earls and others, who had fled towards Carlisle, were captured on the way at Bothwell Castle, for the warden, Sir Walter Gilbertson, a Scot who had held the castle down to that time for the King of England, perceiving that his countrymen had won the battle, allowed the chief men who came thither to enter the castle in the belief that they would find a safe refuge, and when they had entered, he took them prisoners. Many also were taken, wandering around the castle, and hither and thither in the country, and many were killed. It was said also that certain knights were captured by women, nor did any of them get back to England save in abject confusion. After this victory, Robert the Bruce was commonly called King of Scotland by all men, because he had acquired Scotland by force of arms.
Chroniclers were inclined to look for the hand of God in such a decisive victory, won against such heavy odds. It was even claimed that the English defeat was by way of divine retribution for the plundering of a monastery on the way north, but the real reasons were purely military ones. In the first place, Bruce chose his ground wisely. While his pikemen were able to operate effectively on the muddy karstland, it was totally unsuitable for the heavy English cavalry. Although he made preparations to fight a defensive battle in the New Park if he had to, he probably intended right from the very beginning to fight the battle in the castle if he could. Secondly, although his army was greatly outnumbered by the English one, it was much better trained. King Edward's knights were extremely brave, but undisciplined. As a result, their superior numbers were more of a handicap than an advantage. In simple terms, they all got in each other's way. Worse still, there was no effective chain of command on the English side. Not only was Bruce able to control his army, he was also able to judge when best to commit his reserves to the fighting. His own schiltron had rescued an outflanked left wing. The dangerous threat posed by the English archers was promptly dealt with by a well-timed cavalry charge, and his final reserve, the Highland Gillies, was called forward at precisely the right psychological moment. King Robert and his army won the Battle of Bannockburn because they deserved to.
There was no gainsaying the overall significance of the Battle of Bannockburn. It earned Scotland 3 centuries of freedom from English rule. Independence, in other words. But militarily speaking, we also learned some very important lessons from this engagement. First of all, there was a danger of overconfidence. English armies had often defeated Scots armies in previous occasions, particularly the Battle of the Standard is a very good example of that, and they were therefore somewhat over-assured of success, and that is always a dangerous thing. Furthermore, many of the young knights who were now in the army for probably the first time in 1314 were inexperienced and certainly indisciplined in the way they conducted their duties, and that was linked to this matter of being overconfident. The English also learnt the vital importance of a good leader. Now, no one can impugn Edward II's bravery. He fought extremely bravely on this particular day, but that was not his role. He was meant to be in control, and that he was not, nor had he deputed control to another big magnate in his behalf. So there are arguments amongst the next commanders about what they were supposed to be doing, so it all broke down on this matter of having a real leader in charge. English losses were pretty horrendous. 22 earls, 68 barons, 1,000 spearmen and archers. And as we know, a further 1,500 became prisoners later, having been tricked into entering a castle. So this was a very severe defeat for the English feudal army. And it was going to be some years before it could pick up its act again and make the whole thing highly effective. But of course, in Edward III, the next king, we were to bring one of our foremost kings of all periods as a soldier, fighter, into the scene, and the days of Edward II would soon be forgotten.
Nevertheless, as the Lanercost chronicler sadly admitted, Bruce had decisively proved his right to the throne of Scotland at Bannockburn. Arguably, King Edward I had in fact been justified in considering the King of Scots to be his feudal vassal, but the long wars of independence established that the ordinary people of Scotland owed no fealty to England's king. This determination was made explicit in the Declaration of Arbroath, drawn up 6 years later in 1320. In it, Bruce's part in the struggle is fulsomely acknowledged, but it goes on to state that should he fail his people, we would instantly strive to expel him as our enemy and the betrayer of his own rights and ours, and we would choose another king to rule over us, who would be equal to the task of defence. It is the shortest paragraph in the Declaration, however, which is the most significant, and which still thunders down the centuries. For so long as 100 men remain alive, we shall never, under any condition, submit to the domination of the English. It is not for glory, or riches, or honours that we fight, but only for liberty, which no good man will consent to lose but with his life.
This is the story of one of British history's most crucial battles and how it was influenced by the terrain over which it was fought. The programme uses the latest animation techniques to explain how the line of fire affected the outcome of the battle, which won the freedom of a nation. The Battle of Bannockburn is a rare example of a single decisive action which not only decided the outcome of a campaign, but of a whole war. With his crushing victory over King Edward II's English army, the Scottish king, Robert the Bruce, won not just the field of Bannockburn, but the freedom of his country.
It's impossible to overstate the significance of the Battle of Bannockburn to Scottish history. It's one of these rare events where the outcome of not just a battle but also of a campaign and effectively a nation is decided in a single day.
It proved that Robert Bruce was not just a good guerrilla warrior, but he was able to speak the military language of the time. He was able to win a battle on a field.
It represents the greatest defeat of English arms by a Scottish army throughout the Middle Ages. But more importantly, it was the one conventional battle which Robert the Bruce had to win. And really, if the Scots had lost Bannockburn, then any chance for independence would probably have been lost.
Legend has it that Robert the Bruce drew inspiration from the determined efforts of a single spider. Such colourful folklore has endured, at least in part, because there are few surviving records from the time of Bannockburn. However, of those which do survive, two in particular are significant. The first, the Lanecost Chronicle, which was written by an Augustine friar at the Lanecost Priory near Carlisle, tells the story very vividly from the English point of view. The monk himself saw many of the events that day. On the Scots side, the most important source is The Bruce, a long poem by an Aberdonian monk called Barber, which also draws extensively on eyewitness accounts of the battle. The subject of the poem is the man who was then a claimant to the vacant throne of Scotland, the future King, Robert Bruce.
Robert the Bruce was one of 13 claimants for the throne of Scotland. At that time, the throne was in the gift of Edward I, and he was certainly in no hurry to appoint a successor. But the Bruce was one of those individuals who was not going to be thwarted, and he decided that he personally was going to fight his way through the throng of competitors by whatever means were necessary, and he was going to seize the throne of Scotland.
At first, Robert Bruce's loyalties were, to say the least, uncertain.
Robert the Bruce in himself is a much more ambivalent figure than Scottish patriotic myth suggests. As a young 20-year-old noble, he was actually fighting on the English side. He joins the Scottish rebellion under William Wallace and fought for a while, but then deserted it. Indeed, his wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, was his prize for deserting the Scottish cause.
Robert the Bruce, therefore, was not, like William Wallace, committed to Scotland's independence from the very start. Robert the Bruce's family, the Bruce family, was very powerful in Galloway, the southwestern part of Scotland.
And they were closely tied to the English crown. Robert himself was born in England, and his personal wealth depended very much in the tradition of balancing his English commitments against his Scottish commitments in an effort to get as much power as possible in Scotland without offending the English crown and endangering his estates in England.
In fact, Bruce was still fighting with the English when they took Stirling Castle in 1305. But even as he fought for his English overlords, he was already plotting to overthrow them.
Edward I is one of the greatest kings ever to come from these islands. He was a warrior, he was a statesman, he was a very astute politician. He'd been on a crusade to the Holy Land, he had dealt with civil strife very firmly in England, and he'd subdued the Welsh. He was an all-round king at a time when a king needed to be personally, physically strong and decisive.
He was from the Plantagenet family, and people said that the Plantagenets were descended from the devil, and it was based on their having a fiery temper.
With the tragic death of Alexander III, Scotland was left without a clear heir to the throne, and the Scottish nobles actually they asked Edward I to adjudicate as to who had the best claim. This was really like inviting the fox into the chicken coop.
He took advantage of Scotland's period of weakness caused by the death of the king and the lack of an obvious heir to impose himself on Scotland as a superior overlord. There's no doubt he was a pretty ruthless medieval king, but also effective.
At the beginning of the year 1306, Bruce changed sides for the last time. His overriding ambition was to claim the vacant throne of Scotland, and to achieve this goal, he ruthlessly murdered John Comyn, his nearest remaining rival, in the chapel of Dumfries Abbey.
The deal was the two individuals, Bruce and Comyn, had been joint guardians. They hated one another's guts. There are accounts of them being at one another's throats. They never got on very well. And when Bruce decided to make his bid for the throne, we think inspired by the terrible death of William Wallace, because Wallace was executed in 1305, Bruce makes his bid in 1306. But what Bruce has to do is to buy off the possible opposition to his own bid in Scotland. Otherwise he's going to face civil war. So Comyn's one of the major players. He's a big noise in the Highlands of Scotland. So they decide to meet at Greyfriars Church. I think they were just meant to try and negotiate some kind of compromise, and they lost their tempers. And Bruce, in the heat of the moment, stabbed the Comyn near unto death, as they say. And the story is that he staggers out of the church and says to his faithful retainer, Kilpatrick, "I think I've slain Comyn." And Kilpatrick says, "I'll mak sicker, I'll make sure." He goes back in and finishes him off. It's the worst possible scenario for Bruce. He's automatically excommunicated because he's defiled the sanctuary. The worst thing you can do. He's also generated civil war with the supporters of John Comyn, the very thing he wanted to avoid. And worst of all, he's taken on the might of Edward I.
Although he was excommunicated for his crime, Bruce still had himself crowned King of Scots on Palm Sunday, 1306. Edward I received news of the events north of the border with anger and resolved to deal with the threat posed by the Bruce. But at 68, he was far too old and exhausted by long years of campaigning. Much against the advice of his household, Edward raised his army and once again marched north. However, his strength finally deserted him, and he died at Burr-on-Sands, 3 miles short of the border with Scotland. With the king dead, the invasion of Scotland was abandoned. Edward I would be a hard act to follow. Not only was the aptly named Hammer of the Scots a very experienced soldier, he was also a great statesman. His son, Edward II, was clearly a very different man to his father.
Edward II was entirely different to his father. Edward I was an extremely experienced soldier. He had campaigned in many different countries, France, Wales and Scotland. He was a tough old veteran who knew his business. His son, Edward II, was not interested in military campaigns. He was much more interested in the good life and really did not want to be troubled by such affairs.
He showed very poor judgment in who he favoured, and of course his favours were sometimes handed out on a sexual basis. His homosexuality was notorious, and his male favourites reaped many of the rewards his barons believed they should have.
Edward II certainly wasn't the man that his father was. But having said that, the modern view that he was an ineffective homosexual doesn't really seem, in my view, to be completely supported by the evidence. The king was a lover of art and literature. He was certainly a cultured man in an age where physical qualities were probably more important. But if you actually examine the historical record, the real facts are fairly scant to label a charge like that against him.
Robert the Bruce lost no time in capitalising on the weaknesses of the new English king, and slowly but surely he tightened his grip on Scotland. By the summer of 1314, he was undeniably King of Scots. The famous legend of the spider may well have played its part.
The legend of the spider is very famous in Scotland. Essentially, after the Battle of Methven in 1305, Bruce and his band of followers had been beaten comprehensively and scattered. When he entered a cave, hiding from the English, he brushed against a spider's web and sat down entirely despondent. But he noticed that the spider began to build his web again, and Robert the Bruce, probably out of malice or spite, brushed the spider again and then sat back down despondently. But the spider simply started to rebuild its web once again. And it is said that from this moment of entire despondency and gloom, Robert the Bruce took the message that he must try and try again, that as long as he had the willpower to continue the struggle against England, then he would eventually be successful.
The first reference to Bruce and the Spider comes in Sir Walter Scott's Tales of a Grandfather, 1830. There's not a trace of it before that. There is a legend from the 17th century which associated a spider with the Black Douglas, Robert Bruce's famous sidekick, but no association between Bruce and the spider. What we have here is a great example of instant legend, or the invention of tradition.
I don't think it's really important any longer whether there was an actual spider or whether it's an apocryphal story. It's a very inspiring and uplifting image that's quite universal of a man who, despite all the adversity, tries and tries again. And in real life, Bruce, despite having tremendous adversity in his personal life and in his political life, kept trying and trying and trying till he won in the end. So it's a very fitting legend.
One by one, the towns and castles of Scotland had been stormed by the Bruce. Now only one remained in English hands: Stirling Castle, the key to the kingdom. Although not as large as Edinburgh Castle, Stirling was strategically far more important. It dominated the central plain in the middle of Scotland, where most of the wealth and population was concentrated. Today, it is still a majestic and awe-inspiring sight. In the Middle Ages, it was a daunting fortress. For the Scots, the capture of Stirling Castle was of vital, symbolic and strategic importance. Unlike his warrior father, Edward II was no soldier, but even he recognised that if Stirling Castle fell back into the hands of the Scots, the war and the country was effectively lost.
Castles in general were very important strongholds for dominating an area militarily.
It gave you a place where you could rest, requisition your forces, build up your strength and sally out to attack the enemy. And it really meant that unless you'd captured all of the castles as well as the land around it, you really didn't have control of a captured country.
Determined to relieve the beleaguered English garrison, King Edward gathered an army about him and marched north. He was spurred on by the disturbing news that the governor of the castle, Sir Philip Mowbray, had agreed to surrender to the Scots if the garrison was not relieved by Midsummer's Day. Edward's march, therefore, became not only a show of military strength, but a race against time. Both sides were only too well aware of the importance of the coming encounter. The long, drawn-out struggle was about to be decided one way or another in a final, thunderous battle. At the heart of King Edward's army at Bannockburn were his household knights, a contingent of armoured cavalrymen permanently employed by him. In all, Edward mustered something approaching 3,000 heavy cavalrymen. Not all of them were knights, of course. Some were ordinary men-at-arms, but by comparison to the Scots, they were very well equipped.
The mounted knights were the heaviest component of the army. They were the equivalent of, in medieval terms, of the Panzer division. They were massively strong, where all the strength was concentrated, and they were intended as the shock troops. They relied upon their weight and the force of their impact.
More often than not, a charge of heavy chivalry will make infantry in front of it run away.
That meant that they were often used for the decisive blow on the battlefield, and even though they were sometimes unruly, their charge often decided the fate or outcome of a battle.
Accompanying the new king on his march north were 20,000 infantrymen. Many of these were raised from the Welsh marches, but the Irish Prince of Connaught was also requested to provide Irish spearmen to serve in the army.
While cavalry can mount a decisive blow, can shock an opponent and hopefully pursue him from the battlefield, infantry is and always has been the only arm of an army which can hold ground.
Infantry provided the flexible all-arms dimensions to break down the sorts of formations that might block heavy cavalry.
Once they'd been mustered for service, the foot soldiers were organised into units of 20 men, led by an officer called a vantanar, from the French word meaning 20. 5 of these units, or vantains, were grouped together into a company, led by a centenar. He rode on horseback, wearing full armour, and was often a professional soldier. There was no formal organisation of the army above the level of the company. Come the day of a battle, it was customary practice to organise the various companies into 3 great divisions or battles. The vanward, the mainward, and the rearward. It was the job of the marshal, the medieval equivalent of a chief of staff, to allocate the different companies to each division, taking care to ensure that all 3 had an even proportion of archers and spearmen. The infantry were, of course, much less heavily armed and equipped than the cavalry. Over their basic clothing of shirt, hose and doublet, foot soldiers commonly wore padded quilted jackets of canvas or leather, perhaps a mail, together with simple iron helmets. If they belonged to a lord's retinue or were in the direct pay of the king, they wore livery coats displaying their master's badge. Often the Red Cross of St. George was added to the coats of the infantry.
You can imagine when 2 armies finally became locked together in hand-to-hand combat, and this was in the days before uniforms had widely been accepted, it was very difficult to identify who was on your side and who wasn't. For that reason, a lord would issue liveried coats to his army. That helped to identify who was on your side and who was on the opposition side.
The Scots army could not have been more different from the English. The most important element of the Scots army was not the mounted knights, but the infantry, who were mainly armed with spears known as long pikes. The Scots combined their companies into much larger bodies of pikemen called schiltrons, a Scots term which quite literally means moving thickets. Each of these moving hedgehogs of pikes was about 3,000 strong. The men were densely packed, shoulder to shoulder, forming a forest of spear points which posed a formidable obstacle to charging cavalry.
One man in a spear on a flat field against a man on a horse is going to die. But a group of men in a formation carrying spears is a much more formidable task. Indeed, horses will not actually go into such a formation, they will shy away from it.
Now, of course, such weapons were not new. Alexander's Macedonians had used very long pikes, as long as 20 foot long, back in ancient times. By Robert the Bruce's day, the Scottish spear or pike tended to be about 12 foot long, which made it a bit handier for individual combat, but still long enough to be used collectively.
The schiltron, the idea of that was more of defensive, I think. It's been compared to a hedgehog with a kind of semicircle and spears sticking out, close ranks and archers between the spears. The idea was the spears would protect the defending troops against a cavalry charge. The archers would do their damage as well. But it clearly didn't work at Falkirk. So in terms of effectiveness, I'm afraid the schiltron perhaps is not that impressive at this particular juncture anyway.
They are not effective against archers. Archers can stand 16, 18, 20 feet from you even, further than you can hit with your pike, and they can shoot you with the bow.
Despite this, the Scots nobles shared these dangers with their men. While the English leaders rode with the cavalry, the Scots knights dismounted and fought in the front ranks of the schiltrons, shoulder to shoulder with their men. King Edward assembled his army at Berwick on the 10th of June 1314 and, travelling north by way of Edinburgh, reached Falkirk, barely 10 miles from Stirling, on the evening of the 22nd. The King of Scots was waiting for him. Unlike William Wallace at Stirling Bridge 17 years earlier, Bruce had chosen his battlefield with considerable care.
The Scots army had chosen some very favourable positions indeed for the Battle of Bannockburn. And it's quite rare in medieval warfare that they had actually had the time to choose their site and prepare for the battle.
The English army needed to approach Stirling Castle itself to relieve the siege that had been going on, as per their agreement. And the closer you get to Stirling and the valley of the River Forth, the worse the countryside gets for an army like the English.
Stirling was surrounded by a low floodplain known as a carse, a wet, marshy area quite unsuitable for cavalrymen. The old Roman road, however, followed a spine of slightly higher, dry ground. A couple of miles south of Stirling, the road crossed a narrow stream called the Bannockburn, and then ran over a low plateau with patches of woodland. This area had been reserved by the Scottish kings as a hunting ground and was called the New Park. It was obvious that King Edward's strategy would be to advance on Stirling along the Roman road. He had with him a huge baggage train which could not be dragged across open country. Bruce, therefore, deployed his army among the trees of the New Park, just north of the ford over the Bannockburn. Pots or pitfalls were dug across the front of this position, so that if the English cavalry tried to force their way up the road, they'd have not one but two difficult obstacles to negotiate before coming into contact with the Scots infantry. On the other hand, the flat carse to the east of the New Park was left invitingly empty. On Sunday, the 23rd of June, the English army cautiously felt its way forward to the Bannockburn, halting about half a mile to the south. At this point, Sir Philip Mowbray, the governor of Stirling, is said to have slipped out of the castle to advise King Edward that large bodies of Scots infantry had been seen moving amongst the trees of the New Park. Bruce had in fact taken up a position of all-round defence in the park. As Edward advanced along the road from the south, he would soon discover the elaborate and perhaps rather obvious obstacles placed in his path.
But there was still the danger that while he held and protected the main high road to Stirling Castle, there was still the danger that the English might outflank him either to the left or the right. On the left, the King's Park made it less likely, and that meant that in some respects Bruce almost was anticipating or forcing the English to move to their right and into the much more boggy ground of the Bannockburn and Pellstream Burn.
King Edward began by sending 2 squadrons of cavalry forward to inspect the new park before committing himself. The first English reconnaissance party, led by the impetuous nephew of the Earl of Hereford, Sir Henry de Bohun, advanced straight up the road, splashed across the ford over the Bannockburn, and began taking note of the Scots' defences. To his complete shock, he came face to face with the Bruce himself. He was quite alone. For young de Bohun, this was an opportunity too good to miss, and taking up his lance, he rode straight at the Bruce.
Think of this from the point of view of Robert Bruce. You've gone out for a bit of a reconnaissance. You're not on a big expensive war horse, you're on a small horse. You're not wearing your heavy armor, and coming towards you, you see Henry de Bohun. Huge guy, huge horse, a lot of armor, a lot of stuff on top of his helmet to make him look even bigger than he was, and he's thundering towards you at a hand gallop, as fast as he can make his horse go and still keep it under control. Tremendous momentum. He's got a lance, and it's pointed right at you. And Robert the Bruce sidesteps his pony, and he cuts Henry de Bohun's head in half.
It certainly shows that Bruce was a veteran soldier, well able to defend himself and of great physical strength. He wasn't going to have any stripling of an English knight see him off at this most critical phase of the engagement.
Having said that, for a commander in the field to risk his person in such a way certainly is quite a rash move, because if Bruce had the worst of the fight against de Bohun, the battle would have been over and the chances of Scottish independence would have been squashed there and then.
The episode ended when some Scots cavalry rather belatedly appeared at the Bruce's side to chase off de Bohun's startled followers. The Bruce's only comment was to complain about the perfectly good battle axe which had been broken in the act of dispatching de Bohun. Meanwhile, the second English reconnaissance party, led by Sir Robert de Clifford and Sir Henry de Beaumont, had run into real trouble. Crossing the Bannockburn further to the east, they had kept to open ground and were working their way around what appeared to be the open flank of the Scots' position, when a schiltron of pikemen suddenly rolled out of the woods towards them. As his pikemen came clear of the trees, their leader, the Earl of Moray, halted for a moment in order to give them time to close up their ranks. It was then that a furious argument broke out between the leaders of the English cavalry. A Yorkshire knight, Sir Thomas Grey, was in favour of charging the Scots immediately, while they were still in some disorder. But de Beaumont wanted to wait, confident that the more Scots who were allowed to come out of the trees, the more would be slain. Neither of the Englishmen had any doubts at all that they could overcome what appeared to be a rabble of unarmoured pikemen. Stung by de Beaumont's sneering, Grey lost his composure and rushed straight at the Scots and was killed at once by the pikemen. Other English knights soon followed him. Try as they might, the English knights could not break into the serried mass of pikes pressing towards them. In their frustration, some even flung their lances at the Scots like javelins. As the Scots resumed their advance from the woods, the English cavalry broke and fled in disorder, some to Stirling, others back to King Edward's camp. Having made their point in no uncertain terms, Moray's pikemen calmly marched back into the shade of the trees. The first round of the battle had undoubtedly gone to the Scots, but King Edward now knew that while a frontal assault straight up the Roman road would be fraught with danger, it might be possible to outflank the Scots' position by following Robert de Clifford's route. And so, that night, the entire English army ponderously swung around to its right, struggling across the Bannockburn to the east of the new park, and then waited uncomfortably for dawn.
The English army was exhausted. The horses needed water. They basically needed space to spread out into. And it seemed logical to the English to spread out into the triangle made by the Bannockburn and some of the minor streams, where there was enough flat ground to bivouac for the night and to water the horses.
What the English did not realise during that evening and then into the night was that they were essentially placing themselves in a trap where the streams and burns and indeed the River Forth would constrain their deployment the next day and give the Scots a great advantage to hem them into a position from which they would find it difficult to get out.
The Bruce seized his opportunity, and while the English army floundered in the mud and stagnant ponds, he swung his own army around, forming 3 of his schiltrons into a line ready to face the English at dawn. The schiltron on the right was commanded by the Bruce's brother, Edward, while the central schiltron came under the Earl of Moray. Sir James Douglas commanded the schiltron on the left. Meanwhile, the king's own schiltron formed a reserve. Unlike the English, the Scots had very few cavalry at Bannockburn. Most of the Scottish knights who were present fought on foot in the front rank of the pikemen. Bruce had at his disposal only 500 light horsemen, led by Sir Robert Keith. These he placed well out on the left flank of the army, where they could guard against any sortie by the garrison of Stirling Castle.
Scotland had virtually nothing to match the heavy mounted English chivalry. Now that's partly a comment on the number of wealthy Scottish nobles who actually were fighting with the English rather than the Scottish. What was used at Bannockburn seems to be roughly 500 much lighter horsemen who would have been equipped without the heavy plate metal armour that films like Braveheart have made so famous. More mobile, in many ways more flexible, but if forced to actually face a charge of English heavy cavalry, totally incapable of doing so.
There was one other element in the Scots army which was to play a crucial role. Hidden from the view of the English forces on nearby Coxted Hill were the camp followers and Highland auxiliary forces who had come to lend the Scots army help. They watched the proceedings intently and would later play a vital role as the events of the day unfolded. In stark contrast to the carefully laid plans of the Scots army, confusion now reigned among the English forces. There were, for instance, no recognizable divisions of the army, just 2 long lines, one drawn up behind the other. The front line was composed of 9 squadrons of cavalry, each one about 250 strong, while on the left of the line stood a much larger division of some 800 cavalrymen, which was rather optimistically called the vanguard. Behind this colourful array of cavalrymen, the English infantry were drawn up in a single, disorderly mass, hemmed in between the Bannockburn and the River Forth. At Falkirk in 1298, the wily old King Edward I had defeated the Scots under William Wallace by attacking and defeating each schiltron in turn. But the son was not the master tactician his father had been, and Edward II was now faced with a far more cunning adversary. Robert the Bruce's tactics at Bannockburn were very different from those adopted by Wallace. He would not wait to be attacked. The Scots would strike first. Before the attack, the Scots army fell to its knees in prayer for safe deliverance in the coming battle. Edward is said to have mistaken the Scots' prayer for a plea for mercy. Any doubts he may have had were about to be unceremoniously removed as Bruce formed his schiltrons into columns and advanced down the gentle slope from St Ninian's Kirk and the New Park, down towards the disorderly rabble which was the English army.
He knew how important it was to keep the English force penned into this small area and not allow them to deploy and spread out. So by attacking with his schiltrons, he certainly put the cat among the pigeons.
The decision that Bruce took to actually enact that offensive move quite clearly stunned the English. The idea that what they considered half-trained Scots peasants would actually take the battle to them was not in their minds.
Now, you could only give English knights one order. You couldn't tell them to wheel right and wheel left. You couldn't give them anything complicated. The one thing they knew how to do was charge. And when the Scottish army comes down out of the woods, down the hill and out onto the flat of Stirling Carse, the English knights did the only thing they were trained to do. They charged.
Time and time again, they hurled themselves at the Scots' pikes. None could break through. The Scots stood resolutely, concentrating on killing the horses, and as each mailed knight fell or kicked himself clear of his dying horse, he was quickly dispatched with swords or axes.
By advancing against the knights with his spearmen, the Bruce had drawn the sting from the English army. That was their main tactic, and once that advantage to charge home had gone, really Edward was on the back foot from then on.
Bannockburn was no elegant, chivalrous encounter. It was a muddy, brutal killing match in which no prisoners were taken and fine gentlemen were ruthlessly butchered by common soldiers.
This isn't the modern world. This was fought under completely different rules with a completely different set of values. Those who were injured or wounded in battle would be dispatched without any form of compassion. Your chances of surviving a wound were nil.
The mass of dead horses and dead men began to pile up. That made it more difficult for the second ranks of the English cavalry, and the Scots infantry during the battle, their cry was push on, to constantly constrain the English. And again, the image is really quite horrific. A struggling mass of men and horses being thrown from their horses by the Scottish infantry and then speared once they're on the ground.
Behind the embattled knights, the English infantry stood in frustration, unable to intervene in the struggle. From time to time, the archers amongst them tried to provide some assistance by shooting over the knights' heads in the hope of hitting the closely packed ranks of Scots pikemen on the other side of the melee. Unfortunately, they also succeeded in shooting many of their own men in the back, and they were soon ordered to stop. However, some archers managed to work their way around to the right of the English line, well clear of the fighting. From this position, they were able to shoot into the exposed flank of the Bruce's own schiltron, without fear of hitting their own men. As casualties among the pikemen mounted, Bruce called his own cavalry into battle.
Archers at that time would normally protect their position by digging in stakes into the ground that would protect them against cavalry, but because the archers had moved into position, there was the prospect of being able to disperse them with a quick cavalry charge, and the Bruce saw that opportunity and unleashed his cavalry at exactly the right moment.
The cavalry would be exposed to archery fire for a few minutes as they charged, but once they got in close, the English archers would not be able to defend themselves.
The archers were quickly scattered and cut down. The threat to the Scots' flank had been averted. The battle had now been raging for an hour, and all around it was going badly for the English. Even King Edward had to defend himself with his mace as hands pulled and tugged at his harness. The battle was at a crucial stage, and it was now that Bruce unleashed a tactical masterstroke. He called forward his last reserve. Legend has it that the men who now suddenly appeared with their makeshift banners on the top of Coxted Hill in the New Park were just camp followers, a motley collection of grooms, cooks and sutlers. As English knights struggled to overcome the Scots pikemen, the Bruce chose the moment perfectly to call the poor folk forward.
The legend of the camp followers is another one of these tremendous romantic stories that surround the Battle of Bannockburn. We'll never know for sure. Were they the camp followers, or was this the Highland army which the Bruce had kept in reserve till the last moment. Some historians come down firmly on the side. They were the Highland, what were known as the gillies, the men who were warriors in their own right, but not sufficiently disciplined to take their place in the schiltrons. The other school of thought argues it was the cooks, the camp followers, the families, the ordinary people of Scotland who'd gathered together to watch this battle and who made makeshift banners when they could see the tide turning against them and used these to give the impression to the English that a new army had joined in the battle. It's certainly a colourful and a powerful legend, and it's one really you can believe if you like, because we'll never have the evidence. We don't know, and we won't ever know, were they Highlanders, were they camp followers? Was it a mix of the two? You know, it's possible it could be any of those things.
And to be quite frank, the English army had already had enough. And all it took was the arrival of this supposedly fresh force for the English to decide that now was the time to seek safety.
Their dismay turned to horror as they realised that they were being driven backwards deeper into the bog. The Lanercost Chronicle graphically recalled the carnage. In the leading division were killed the Earl of Gloucester, Sir John Cumming, Sir Pagan de Tiptoft, Sir Edmund de Morley, and many other nobles, besides foot soldiers who fell in great numbers. Another calamity which befell the English was that whereas they'd earlier crossed a great ditch called the Bannockburn, into which the tide flows, and now wanted to recross it in confusion, many nobles and others fell into it with their horses in the crush, while others escaped with great difficulty, and many were never able to extricate themselves from the ditch. Thus, Bannockburn was spoken about for many years in English throats. Not all of the English knights turned to flee. In an act of futile courage, Sir Giles d'Argentine, an old crusader, fought his way through to King Edward's side, led him safely from the battlefield, and then, declaring, "I have never been accustomed to run," returned to the fight and certain death. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, had won his battle. Although many Scots pikemen were killed, mainly by English arrows, only 2 Scottish knights, Sir William de Vipond and Sir Walter Ross, were slain. As for the defeated English, so many of them were killed in trying to flee across the Bannockburn that it was said to be possible to walk dry-shod over their corpses. The relentless pursuit and ruthless killing went on into the midsummer night.
Of course, there was no Geneva Convention in those days, and the ordinary infantry certainly couldn't expect any mercy. And don't forget, the English army is now stranded, miles from home, in the midst of very hostile country. The mounted men have some prospect of escape, but for the men on foot and for the camp followers with their baggage, there's absolutely no prospect in reality of being able to flee back to England.
Many factors had contributed to the Scots' victory at Bannockburn. The Bruce had chosen his ground wisely. While his pikemen were able to operate effectively on the muddy castland, it was totally unsuitable for the heavy English cavalry. Although his army was greatly outnumbered by the English, it was much better trained. King Edward's knights were brave but undisciplined, and as a result, their superior numbers became a handicap, not an advantage. Put simply, they got in each other's way. Worse still, there was no effective chain of command on the English side. King Edward himself fought bravely as an ordinary knight, while his officers wrangled and argued amongst themselves. Not only was Bruce able to control his army, he was also able to judge when best to commit his reserves to the fighting. In short, King Robert and his army won the Battle of Bannockburn because they deserved to.
Bannockburn was undoubtedly a colossal victory. There's no question about it. Probably the most spectacular victory in Scottish history. As such, it's never been forgotten by certain sections of the Scottish community. The Scottish National Party, for example, still holds annual rallies at Bannockburn. I suppose it's seen as a kind of a shrine of Scottish independence or whatever. But much more important in the longer term was Bruce's propaganda department. They wished, above all, to get Bruce's title recognised. So what the Scots did, the nobles, barons, freeholders and the community of the realm of Scotland, in 1320 they sent a letter to the Pope of the day, really asking the Pope to put pressure on the English king to recognise Bruce's title.
In the famous Declaration of Arbroath, the Bruce's part in the struggle is fulsomely acknowledged, but the declaration clearly states that if he had failed his people, they would instantly strive to expel him as our enemy and the betrayer of his own rights and ours, and we would choose another king to rule over us who would be equal to the task of defence.
That is the earliest statement of the contractual theory of monarchy in European history. They're saying the king is answerable to his subjects. The king is answerable to the laws in exactly the same way that the subjects are answerable to the laws. And what you have there is a massive breakthrough in constitutional terms. We all take these matters for granted now. The next section of the Declaration of Arbroath goes on to say, and this is quoted all over the place, but it's still got it's very moving. For so long as 100 of us remain alive, we shall never surrender. It is not for riches, nor for glory, nor for honours that we fight, but for freedom alone, which no honest man will lose, but with life itself. And if people later on say that Edward was the hammer of the Scots, I'm sorry, I can't accept it. I think the Scots responded to Edward, there's no question about that, but I think they hammered themselves into a nation.
450 years later, the great Scottish poet Robert Burns wrote his famous ballad Scots Wha Hae in honour of the victory at Bannockburn. It is still sung today.
Welcome to your gory bed, run to victory. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front of battle there, see approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery. What will be a traitor?
For hundreds of years, the two kingdoms of Scotland and England were at best uneasy neighbours and all too often enemies. Over the long centuries, countless battles were lost and won. But in the grim and bloody litany of glorious victory and bitter defeat, there is one name which resounds above all others, one battle which saw a proud Scottish king and nearly all his chief nobles, together with thousands of common pikemen, fall in bloody ruin. It was this tragic day in 1513 which inspired a haunting lament still played today over the graves of Scottish soldiers around the world. It tells the story of the death of a generation on the field of Flodden. King James IV of Scotland was in many ways a typical Renaissance prince. He was an unquestioned despot who ruled his country with a firm hand, especially the turbulent borderlands between Scotland and England. Yet he was also passionately interested in the arts, literature and science. Unfortunately, like many another of his contemporaries, he was also drawn to that most destructive of sciences, war. Regrettably for James, his love of war was also shared by his brother-in-law, King Henry VIII of England. Henry was one of the greatest and most powerful sovereigns his country would ever produce. He was strong, foresighted and crafty. He was also headstrong and had many faults. but he was nobody's fool. Henry and James were related by the marriage of James to Henry's sister Margaret. This marriage had been intended to bring peace between Scotland and England. But the marriage and the blood ties it created counted for little in the face of the iron will of Henry of England and the hopelessly romantic James of Scotland. At the end of the 15th century, France had invaded Italy, beginning a series of destructive wars and effectively gaining dominance in southern Europe. To attempt to redress the balance, the Holy League had been created. This was essentially an anti-French alliance which included Venice, Spain, the Papal States and the Holy Roman Empire. In 1511, King Henry, eager for military glory, joined the Holy League. The sworn object of the League was to prevent France from dominating Europe. And faced with the addition of yet another powerful opponent in the form of England, the French king, Louis XII, looked around for some allies of his own. He did not have to look far. For centuries, Scotland and England had been at each other's throats. Many times before, in an effort to offset her weakness in terms of manpower, Scotland had allied herself with France. In 1512, Louis and James once again renewed the Auld Alliance between Scotland and France, by which each country pledged to assist the other in case of an English attack. On the face of it, Scotland had little to gain from such an alliance at this particular time. However, King James was a romantic soul, and even then his military ambitions centred around the chivalric vision of a grand crusade against the Turks, which would recapture the spirit of great crusades of earlier centuries. Despite the outmoded nature of James's goal, Louis cynically encouraged the Scots king with promises of support for this crusade once the present crisis was over. In actual fact, a desperate effort to counterbalance the increased military might of the Holy League by Louis would soon be forced to form an alliance with those very Turks whom James hoped to conquer. As a result of their new political alliance, Scotland would immediately be drawn into any war between France and England, and war with France was exactly what King Henry of England now had in mind. Despite any private reservations the French king may have harboured about James's grand crusading plans, in public he was quick to keep his pledge to support James. The ink on the new treaty was barely dry when French ships began arriving in Scottish ports carrying armour, lanzknecht pikes, gunpowder and other warlike provisions. Not for the crusade, of course, but to strengthen the Scots army for the coming war with England. By the beginning of 1513, Scotland and England were firmly locked into what could be fairly described as an arms race. There were occasional clashes at sea, but otherwise the two countries remained uneasily at peace. With his back as secure as it was ever likely to be, the warlike Henry of England eagerly wished to join with his continental allies in pursuing a war with Louis. He therefore began mobilizing his army for a campaign in France. Faced by this threat, King Louis of France mobilized his own army and now called upon his new ally, King James of Scotland, to fulfill his treaty obligations. By dragging Scotland into the war, Louis hoped to open a second front against Henry, thus dragging English troops away from France. Like the great statesman he was, Henry had laid plans for just such an eventuality. Despite having his eyes set firmly on France, Henry was always conscious of the threat from the north. He distrusted the Scots absolutely. He was well aware of what one chronicler called the old pranks of the Scots, which is ever to invade England when the king is out. He had therefore raised not one, but two English armies. One army, drawn principally from the south of England, would campaign with him in France against Louis. Before setting sail for France on the 30th of June 1513, Henry instructed the aged Earl of Surrey to organise this second army in the north of England. He left Surrey with the words, My lord, I trust not the Scots, therefore I pray you not to be negligent of them. By the overt act of war against France, Henry had forced James's hand. To fulfill the objects of the treaty, King James ordered a full mobilization of his forces. At the same time, he formally notified King Henry that he would invade England unless the siege of Therouanne in northern France was lifted. Henry flew into an English rage at this bold request, but once he had calmed down, he refused to be intimidated. In fact, he probably relished the challenge. With the Scots mobilization scheduled to be complete by the 13th of August, the Earl of Surrey was ordered to prepare in his turn for full mobilization of the English Northern Army. Despite James's wholehearted commitment to the war with England, the mood in Scotland was less enthusiastic, and there was a strong possibility that the pleas of his nobles might dissuade James from taking up his obligations under the treaty with France. James, however, had a strong sense of duty and a highly developed personal code of honour, which he modelled upon his own vision of knightly values. Added to this, a romantic sense of chivalry was a weakness for the ladies, which was to be ruthlessly exploited by Louis. Sensing that there was a strong movement in Scotland against war with England, Louis allowed the Queen of France to write a personal letter to James, in which she begged him, as her knight, to protect her from the unwanted attentions of King Henry. With her artful letter, she enclosed a turquoise ring, and, rather more pointedly, sent 14,000 crowns to defray James's costs. James now saw himself as the champion of a fine queen in distress. Never one to withstand an appeal to his chivalry, James would listen to no man. He committed his country to war against England. The disaster of Flodden was now only weeks away. With the king away and the full might of Scotland ranged against him, the Earl of Surrey had quite a task on his hands. And it is a measure of his ability that the king felt able to entrust the safety of the realm to a man who had fought valiantly against his own father, Henry Tudor, at Bosworth Field in 1485, where Henry had won the crown of England to become Henry VII. Despite his previous allegiance, Surrey had gone on to serve Henry VII well as Lord Lieutenant of the North, and when King James of Scotland laid siege to Norham Castle in northern England during 1497, it was Surrey who had successfully marched to its relief. It was only natural, therefore, that he should now be called upon to face James again. The English army which Surrey led at Flodden was made up of a mixture of professional soldiers and militia. It was not a particularly modern army, and apart from its train of artillery, it was very little changed from the armies which had performed so gloriously at Agincourt and Crécy. Like those earlier armies, Surrey's force contained very few cavalrymen. During the 100 Years' War with France, the English men-at-arms, armoured knights and called sergeants had become accustomed to fighting on foot. At the heart of the army was the Earl of Surrey's personal retinue of some 500 men, chiefly drawn from his East Anglian estates. Only 43 of this total were cavalrymen, and only a single man, named Avery of Berwick, wore full armour. It was probably he who carried the royal standard. The greater part of Surrey's men were foot soldiers, making up the equivalent of a single infantry battalion, exactly 446 men and 10 officers armed either with longbows or the formidable brown bill, a vicious cross between a spear and a battle-axe. As these men were to be on royal service, many of them were given a coat in the Tudor livery, colours of white and green. It was meticulously recorded that these cost 4 shillings each. In addition to his own men, Surrey was also responsible for assembling the army's general staff and the artillery, led by the Master of the Ordnance, Sir Nicholas Appleyard. This comprised another 400 gunners, drivers, grooms and craftsmen, looking after 5 brass field guns called serpentines. These monstrous guns fired a 4 or 5 pound ball. They were backed by no fewer than 18 falcons, much lighter pieces which fired a 2 pound ball and gave murderous support to the infantry. Ironically, artillery was also the great love of the Scottish King James, and he lavished great care and attention on his artillery park, spending a huge proportion of the national wealth on his favourite toy. Despite her relative poverty, by 1513 Scotland possessed an artillery train second to none. But it was to be the English guns of the Earl of Surrey which would have the final say at Flodden. On the 21st of July 1513, the Earl of Surrey mustered his little army at Lambeth in London, and next day headed north to begin the campaign of Flodden. He reached Doncaster by the 1st of August, and from there he sent out letters to the sheriffs of the northern counties, warning them to hold their men in readiness. In the meantime, Sir William Bulmer was ordered to patrol the border with a force of mounted archers. After that, hampered by a shortage of ready money, Surrey waited at Pontefract Castle for firm news of the Scots' intentions. That news was brought by Lord Dacre, the English warden of the West March. On the 13th of August, Lord Hume, the warden of the Scottish East March, had launched a destructive raid into Northumberland, burning 7 villages and driving off a large herd of cattle and horses. The raiders were estimated to be as many as 3,000 strong. But Sir William Bulmer has successfully ambushed Hume and his raiders at a place called Millfield, near Wooler, in the north of England. The Scots were routed, and in the process Hume lost a considerable number of men, as well as his personal banner, and all of his ill-gotten plunder. Just as embarrassing was the fact that a couple of his relatives were amongst the prisoners held by the Empire. Some of those prisoners admitted to Dacre that King James definitely intended to invade England, and had assembled no less than 100,000 men for the purpose. Nevertheless, the prisoners could provide no firm word of where or when the expected invasion would come. It was even possible that a series of heavy raids was intended rather than a full-scale invasion, but they could not tell for sure. So while Lord Hume's relatives moulded in prison, Surrey waited and watched. The wily old Surrey delayed mustering his full army until he was sure the Scots army had indeed crossed the border. In those days, the business of feeding an army in the field was a Herculean task, given the primitive supply systems of the day, and bringing together a large force was not something that an experienced commander undertook lightly. Surrey's wisdom was to serve him well. Hard-riding messengers brought the news to York on the 25th of August that the Scots had not crossed the border until the 22nd of August. Only then did Surrey order a full mobilization. For all armies of this period, desertion was an extensive problem, and in addition, once an army was brought together, the men began to die in large numbers, almost immediately, from either malnourishment or the diseases which resulted from the unhygienic camp practices of the day. Smallpox and typhus were particularly virulent killers, and any army assembled in the field quickly began to disappear before the eyes of its frustrated commanders. By delaying his major muster, Surrey avoided these dangers. Surrey expected the Scots to proceed to lay siege to Berwick upon Tweed, as was their usual custom in conflicts between their countries. But he was to be deceived. Instead, they attacked the English border stronghold of Norham Castle. the governor confidently announced that he would hold out long enough for King Henry to return from France if necessary, but Surrey was taking no chances. On the 26th of August, he left York and headed north, gathering troops on the way. By the 30th of August, Surrey was at Durham, where he collected the contingents from the bishopric and the great banner of St. Cuthbert, a potent rallying symbol for the English northerners. 2 days later, Surrey was in Newcastle upon Tyne. Lord Dacre, with a large number of English borderers, joined him there, but Surrey also heard the disconcerting news that Norham Castle had fallen after a siege of just 5 days. The border was wide open, and there was no time to lose. Surrey next moved northwards to Alnwick. On the 4th of September, he was joined there by his eldest son, the Lord Admiral of England, with 1,210 professional soldiers who had been serving as Marines. Their officers were to be invaluable to Surrey, as were a dozen experienced German gunners who accompanied them. Most of the day of August the 30th was taken up with a planning conference. As the English army was predominantly composed of militiamen, they would soon be clamouring to go home, so there was little time to lose. In any case, both the militia and the regulars were a considerable drain on Surrey's meagre coffers, so it obviously made sense to seek battle as soon as possible. The question was how to do it. For against all expectation, the Scots had not advanced southwards. Indeed, they had barely even crossed the border. Throughout Scotland, the mood was less than confident, and a number of seemingly supernatural portents were observed, the most famous of which was described by a Scots chronicler named Pitscotty.
The king came to Linlithgow, very sad and dolorous, making his devotion to God to send him good chance and fortune in his voyage. And there came a man of 50 years, clad in a blue gown, crying and asking for the king, saying that he desired to speak with him. Till at the last he came to the desk before him and said to him in this manner, Sir King, my mother has sent me to thee, desiring thee not to go where thou art purposed. For if thou do, thou shalt not fare well in thy journey, nor none that are with thee. Further she bade thee converse with no woman, nor use their counsel. For if thou do it, thou wilt be confounded and brought to shame. By the time this man had spoken these words to the king, the evensong was near done, and the king paused on these words, studying to give him an answer. But in the meantime, before the king's face, and in the presence of all the lords that were about him at the time, this man vanished away, as if he'd been one blink of the sun, and could no more be seen.
It is perhaps doubtful whether this apparition was as supernatural as Pitscotty believed. It may even have been a well-managed publicity stunt arranged by the Queen. The pointed reference to the cause of a woman would certainly support that view. It did not sway James, but it certainly must have added to the unsettling tide of omens against the venture. Still in desperation, the peace party argued Scotland's treaty obligations to France could be fulfilled by border incursions, such as Hume's ill-fated raid, which had seen his relatives captured. However, the king would have none of it, and Bulmer's victory over Hume at Millfield merely added another slight to the king's overdeveloped sense of honour. A full-scale invasion it had to be, and that required a full mobilisation of Scotland's army. Since the time of Bannockburn 200 years before, The barons, the freeholders, and the citizens of royal boroughs were obliged to muster themselves and their tenants in their best array for 40 days' military service on receipt of a writ from the king. This writ was now duly issued. The barons and freeholders were also obliged to arm and equip their men and to provide for their upkeep during those 40 days. At the end of that period, the king had either to release them and allow them to return home, or else feed and pay for them himself. This system worked well enough for the defence of the kingdom, where those raised were known as fencibles, that is, men capable of bearing arms defensible. For the defence of the realm, the system was fine, but worked less well beyond a strictly local level. One of the reasons for this was the large distances involved meant that those contingents coming from the Highlands and the far north of Scotland had made substantial inroads into their supplies before they even reached the rendezvous at Edinburgh on the 13th of August. Even more importantly, the time spent in marching could not be spent in training for the coming campaign. Even those levies raised nearer to Edinburgh quite understandably delayed their mustering in order not to waste supplies. But of course, having done so, they too found themselves short of time in which to train in the new tactics. A good many of those who did assemble on Edinburgh's Borough Muir were no doubt hardened fighters, even professional soldiers, who were veterans of many a skirmish where individual battle skills counted for everything. Now, however, both they and the raw ploughboys and weavers filling out the ranks had to learn to work together, manoeuvring and fighting in large, tightly packed masses. But they were to have precious little time in which to do it. The army assembled on the Borough Muir was said to be the largest ever assembled in Scotland. Some contemporaries have calculated it as 60,000 strong. A huge host to be assembled for a poor, backward country like Scotland. By the time the two armies eventually met on Flodden Field, they had been reduced by sickness and desertion to not much more than 20,000 men apiece. But while there was little enough between them in terms of numbers, they were two very different armies. The English army, apart from its up-to-date artillery, was still a medieval one, largely made up of billmen and bowmen. But the Scots army was intended to be a very modern Renaissance army. Although the mustering process was unchanged from the days of Bruce and Wallace, the equipment and tactics reflected the very best of current continental practice. In the 14th century, the Swiss infantry, like the Scots, had successfully held their own against the armoured knights who usually dominated medieval battlefields. Unlike the Scots, however, they had then gone on to exploit their Central European position by hiring themselves out to the great powers of the day. Swiss pikemen rapidly earned a savage reputation throughout Europe as doughty and indeed well-nigh unbeatable soldiers. In the meantime, they spawned their imitators, most notably the famous German Landsknechts, mercenaries who fought for the highest bidder. They too fought with long pikes, and one of the ominous signs of Scotland's preparations for war had been the importation of thousands of Landsknecht pikes. At Antwerp, imperial customs officials gloomily reported the large number of pikes bound for Scotland. But as the Emperor was not at war with the Scots, they could do nothing to intercept them. With the pikes came 40 experienced officers under a French captain named Dossy. Although these officers are usually described as being Frenchmen, they must actually have been Germans, for their task was to train the Scots levies in the new Landsknecht tactics. James probably believed that it would be an easy task, for the pike was a traditional weapon in Scotland. It turned out to be a fatal miscalculation. The old Scots schiltron was little more than a solid mass of men armed with spears. Originally, it had been a defensive formation, ideally suited for fighting against cavalry. At Falkirk, however, Wallace's 4 great schiltrons had been shot to bloody ribbons by King Edward's longbowmen. Bruce, on the other hand, recognised the spear or pike's potential as an offensive weapon, and at Bannockburn formed his schiltrons, or moving thickets of pikes, into attack columns. This demanded considerably more expertise than simply standing fast in a defensive ring. But Bruce, crucially, had the time to train his men. Indeed, as he waited outside Stirling in the summer of 1314, he rehearsed some of the moves his army was to make in the battle. The result, of course, was a resounding victory at Bannockburn, which secured Scotland's independence for hundreds of years to come. Unfortunately, those Scots armies which later attempted to repeat the success almost invariably came to grief, because they had not had the intensive training which Bruce gave his men, nor an answer to the deadly firepower of the longbar, or latterly the arquebusier, an earlier form of musket. King James thought the answer was to adopt Landesknecht tactics, but in fact this decision merely compounded the problem. Instead of fighting in the huge unwieldy bodies of men characteristic of medieval warfare, the Landsknechts formed smaller, more manoeuvrable units. These were then able to deliver fast-moving assaults, preceded by skirmishers armed with arquebuses. The effectiveness of these tactics, however, depended very heavily upon the training and expertise of the troops involved. The Landsknechts were above all professional soldiers, and therefore well able to reach the required standard of proficiency. The Scots army, however, was effectively a conscript militia, and with only a matter of days at best in which to learn the necessary drills, it was perhaps inevitable that things would go wrong. The French commander, Odocy, and his Landsknecht captains will have been only too well aware of this, and it is likely that the apparent inaction which followed the capture of Norham Castle was a result of training in the works of the Scots army. At any rate, after the surrender of Norham on the 29th of August, the Scots made a leisurely advance southwards. The castles of Ford, Etal and Chillingham were quickly battered into submission, and then James established his army in an entrenched camp on Flodden Edge. The king was afterwards criticised by many chroniclers for apparently dallying with the Lady Heron at Ford Castle instead of striking southwards. James certainly had a reputation as a ladies' man, but the key to the question actually lies in the presence of the Landsknecht captains. The establishment of fortified camps was unprecedented in Scottish military history, but it was a well-tried Landsknecht practice. Secure in their mile-long position, the Landsknechts worked hard at preparing the raw Scots pikemen for the battle to come. There is perhaps no reason to doubt that King James, a notorious womanizer, was amorously engaged with Lady Heron, notwithstanding the dire warning of that mysterious man in blue who had appeared at Linlithgow. However, while he was thus amusing himself, the professionals were slowly licking his army into shape. The question was whether the professionals would have enough time, for Surrey needed to fight as soon as possible, and he was not about to let the opposing army slip away. On the 5th of September, Surrey sent Rouge Croix, herald to the Scots king. James, he declared, had entered England and slain English subjects without justice or reason, and he was therefore challenged to try the decision of right by force of arms before Friday next, the 9th of September. Rouge Croix was, of course, expected to take a good look at the Scots army while he was delivering the message and waiting for any reply. Such genteel spying was an accepted aspect of the herald's role, providing it was not too blatant. And Surrey anticipated a return visit in due course from one of the Scots heralds. What he did not anticipate was that James would detain Rouge Croix to prevent Surrey from obtaining that vital information until it was too late. Instead, the Scottish Isla herald turned up in Surrey's camp, with a formal acceptance of the challenge, was detained in his turn and then exchanged for Rouge-Croix. Only when the English herald returned did Surrey realise that he had committed himself to battle with a foe who was posted in a near impregnable position. An immediate demand that the Scots should descend and meet the English on the open plain of Millfield was treated with contempt, and Surrey therefore found himself in an awkward position. The English army was already running very short of provisions. They'd even run out of beer, and in a few days they would have to disband for want of food. Surrey needed to fight while he still had an army, but attempting to storm a fortified hilltop position was out of the question. He had counted on meeting the Scots in the open field, not 500 feet up on Flodden Edge. The only conceivable approach was from the southeast, along the flat ground between the foot of Flodden Hill and the River Till, a narrow and dangerous defile, sure to be swept by the Scottish artillery. The situation was gloomily described by one of the Northumbrians serving under Lord Dacre.
My Lord Surrey removed 6 miles to a field called Wooler Hall, within 3 miles of the King of Scots, where, as every man might see, the said King of Scots did lie with his army upon an high hill in the edge of Cheviot, within 2 miles of Scotland, enclosed on 3 sides by 3 great mountains, so there was no entry or passage unto him, but one way, where was laid marvellous and great ordnance of guns. Seeing that the King of Scots continued in the mountains, he sent unto him Rouge-Croix, pursuivant of arms, and required that he came down into the plain of Millfield, where there was convenient ground for the coming together of 2 armies, or to a ground nearby called Flodden. At this, the king waxed angry with my lord, and would not speak with Rouge-Croix, but had his message by report, and sent reply by a gentleman in these terms: The king, my master, wills that ye show to the Earl of Surrey that it beseemeth him not, being an earl, so largely to attempt a great prince. His grace will take and hold his ground and field at his own pleasure, and not at the assigning of the Earl of Surrey.
Unwilling to admit defeat without a blow having been struck, Surrey now resolved to try and manoeuvre the Scots out of their position. In so doing, he was running a terrible risk. His plan was to march around the eastern flank of the Scots' position and take up a position between Flodden Edge and the Scottish border. If his communications with Scotland were thus cut, the king might then be compelled to come down and give battle. However, such a flank march in the presence of a watchful enemy might easily come to grief, and if the expected battle went badly, the remains of Surrey's army would be trapped between the victorious Scots and the River Tweed. Nevertheless, Surrey considered that he had no choice, and on the 8th he moved his hungry army from Wooler to Barmore Wood, facing the east end of the Scottish position. It was a short march of only 2 miles, but it brought his army into its jumping-off point.
My Lord Surrey marched the 8th day of September, being Our Lady's Day, the Nativity, and passed over the waters of Till, and lodged that night under a woodside called Barmore Wood, directly against the king and his army, albeit there was a hill between the 2 hosts for avoiding the danger of gunshot, and notwithstanding that for 4 or 5 days before there had been little or no wine, ale, nor beer for the people to refresh themselves with, and the whole army, for the most part, was enforced and constrained to drink water for the same time and season, with no comfort or trust of relief in that behalf. My Earl of Surrey and the army, the danger and the want of drink notwithstanding, courageously advanced forward to get between the King of Scots and his realm of of Scotland.
That night, Surrey issued his final orders. The vanguard and the artillery, led by his son the Lord Admiral, was to move northwards and cross the River Till by Twizel Bridge, while Surrey himself led the remainder over the river by a ford at Milford. Next morning, having eaten the last of their rations, they set off at 5 o'clock. The northward move appears to have taken the Scots by surprise. The border reivers, who were acting as scouts, were off raiding villages to the south, and suddenly, at this critical point, King James and his officers were blind. What was Surrey up to? One possibility was that he was simply moving towards Berwick in order to obtain supplies and establish a shorter line of communications. More worryingly, however, he might just as easily be intent on invading Scotland. This, however, could be discounted. The Scots were well aware of the parlous state of Surrey's forces. The northwards move must still therefore be aimed at bringing about a battle on the 9th. But instead of launching a suicidal frontal assault, he was intending to attack the Scots' position from behind. This assessment was agreed by one Giles Musgrave, an English outlaw acting as a guide for King James. He pointed out that Surrey was almost certainly intending to seize Braxton Hill, the more northerly of the three protecting James's position. It was separated from Flodden Hill only by a slight dip, so that if Surrey did succeed in planting his army upon it, he would nullify the Scots' advantage. Indeed, he might even stand on the defensive, forcing the Scots to attack him in order to clear their line of communications. James acted decisively. If this was indeed what Surrey intended, he still had several hours in which to act. Ordering his men to set fire to all the straw and litter in the great camp, he set his army in motion under cover of the resulting smokescreen. The Flodden position was abandoned, and instead the Scots moved a short distance to the northwest to take up a fresh position on Braxton Hill, thus denying it to the enemy, just at the moment when the Admiral's division was struggling to deploy across the Broxburn, a swampy stream. It was not too difficult for his infantry to wade through the morass, but the Admiral had all of the English guns in his charge, and these could only be brought across the narrow causeway known as Brank's Bridge. The unexpected appearance of the Scots on the hill above him came as a shock. His father, with the main body, was still some distance to the east, coming over the Till at Sandyford. It was now about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and defeat was staring the English in the face. Tearing an Agnus Dei medal from his chest, he sent an urgent message to his father, imploring him to make haste. King James determined to seize his opportunity. The Admiral's division was hastily deployed into line of battle, but it was outflanked and separated from the rest of the English army. As a result, it was dangerously exposed, and James saw that he had an opportunity to defeat the English in detail. Any thought of fighting a defensive battle was rejected in favour of hasty, downhill assault. The deployment of the Scots army at Flodden reflected the teaching of the Landsknecht captains. In place of the three traditional huge divisions of medieval warfare, the vanward or advanced guard, the main battle, and the rearward, each drawing up in line from the right, King James's army was organised in 5 smaller divisions. Each of these divisions was in turn made up of 2 or more brigades of pikemen. If Landsknecht practice was being followed, each of these brigades would be preceded by a line of skirmishers, the Verlenhope, or Forlorn Hope. Most of these skirmishers seem to have been armed with arquebuses, but some may have been Highland archers. On the left of the army, and facing the Admiral, was a division commanded by the Earls of Hume and Huntly. Some of the men in Huntly's brigade may have been Highlanders, but like Hume, he also held large estates in the borders, and most of his contingent came from Berwickshire. The next division comprised brigades led by the Earl of Errol, Constable of Scotland, and the Earls of Crawford and Montrose. The men of this division had been raised in the north-east of Scotland and the other lowland shires north of the Firth of Forth. In the centre stood the largest division, commanded by the king himself. This naturally included his own personal retinue and the usual cloud of aristocratic hangers-on who can be relied upon to congregate around the throne. But the bulk of the men in this division were raised in the west of Scotland by the Earls of Glencairn and Cassilis, and the Lords Herries and Maxwell. A short distance to the rear of this division was a brigade of Lothian levies, led by the Earl of Bothwell, and on their right flank stood a division of Highlanders, led by the Earls of Lennox and Argyll. There had been a considerable amount of desertion since the army left Edinburgh, and each of the four main divisions probably mustered no more than 5,000 men, while Bothwell had half that number, making a grand total of about 22,000 men in the Scots army. This was about the same size as Surrey's force. The Scottish advance was made in echelon, with the left-hand division leading. A sudden shower of rain had made the grass slopes slippery, and many of the Scots pikemen took off their boots in an effort to maintain some sort of grip. All, however, came down the hill in the Almain, or German fashion, that is, without shouting or noise. The Borderers made good speed, and long before the other divisions came into contact, they crashed into the Admiral's right wing. On the Admiral's right was a brigade of about 3,000 men commanded by his brother Edmund Howard. Half of them came from Cheshire and Lancashire, while the rest were a fairly mixed bag of Marines and a small contingent from South Yorkshire. In the centre, commanded by the Admiral himself, stood some 9,000 men. Some were Marines clad in the royal livery of green and white, but the greater part of them came from Northumberland, Durham and North Yorkshire. On his left was a very much smaller brigade, commanded by the 70-year-old Sir Marmaduke Constable. This comprised 1,000 levies from Lancashire and an equal number from Northumberland and Yorkshire. As the Scots came down the hill towards them, most of Edmund Howard's brigade broke and fled. It was said that the Cheshire men resented being placed under the command of a Howard instead of one of their beloved Stanleys. But whatever the reason, their desertion left the rest of the brigade horribly exposed. Elated, the two Scots brigade commanded by Hume and Huntley rolled over them. English casualties were heavy, and Edmund Howard himself came close to being captured.
And so it was that the Scots fiercely did set about Master Edmund Howard, captain of the uttermost part of the field on the western side, and between them was so cruel a battle that many of our men of Cheshire and others did flee. So in manner, Master Edmund was left alone and without succour, and his standard and the bearer of the same beaten and hewn in pieces, and he himself right struck to the ground. Howbeit, like a courageous and hardy, lusty young gentleman, he recovered again and fought hand to hand with one Sir Davy Hume and slew him with his own hand. Thus, Master Edmund was in great peril and danger until the Lord Dacre, like a good and trusty knight, came to his relief and gave succour unto him.
To add to the initial Scots success, the Admiral was now being menaced by a second Scots division, that led by the Earl of Errol. Assailed in front and flank at the same time, the Admiral's defeat would have been certain. But in fact, Hume and Huntley failed to exploit their victory. After the victory on the right, it took some time to reorganise their victorious forces before they could move against the English centre. It is in this area that discipline, training and good officers count for everything. Yet this was exactly what the Scots lacked. Eventually, they were pulled back into some sort of order, and Huntley proposed that they should then fall upon the exposed flank of the Admiral's main battle. But by that time, Surrey had sent Lord Dacre's English borderers to his son's assistance, and Hume insisted on facing them instead. This delay and subsequent inactivity proved fatal to the Earl of Errol and his division. With only 5,000 men, it was outnumbered almost 2 to 1 by the 9,000 men of the Admiral's main battle, and a counterattack by Sir Marmaduke Constable's brigade completed Errol's discomfiture. With all their leaders slain, the Scots of Errol's division retreated back up the hill to rejoin those under Hume and Huntley. Effectively, there was not one, but 2 battles being fought out on the slopes below Branxton Hill that evening. The Admiral had decisively won his battle, and it now remained to be seen how his father would fare against the King. At the outset of the battle, the King's beloved artillery, commanded by Robin Borthwick, had been quite effective. When Dacre was ordered to go to the Admiral's assistance, Borthwick laid down a barrage which routed the levies from Tynedale and Bamburghshire, before Nicholas Appleyard managed to bring the English guns into action. Some of Appleyard's guns were tasked with counter-battery fire, while the others successfully engaged the King's division, which was still making its way down the hill towards Surrey's men. The crisis of the battle was approaching. King James dismounted from his horse, and snatching up a pike, placed himself in the front rank of his division. It was quite traditional for pikemen to be led on by their officers, but James was no Lands-Connacht captain. He was a king, and more importantly, a commander-in-chief. His place was in the saddle directing the battle. However inspiring his action, by placing himself in the front rank, he relinquished all control over his mighty army, and arguably threw away any chance of winning the battle. It may simply have been one of those impetuous decisions for which he was notorious, but it is more likely that James never had any intention of directing the struggle once battle was joined. Both armies were more or less equal in numbers, and it was to be a straightforward fight to the death. Death came quickly to many in the King's division. As they came down the slope, the rest of Nicholas Appleyard's gunners switched from counter-battery fire to the altogether much more tempting target presented by the massed ranks of Scots pikemen. They could hardly miss. It was just as well for Surrey that his guns were so effective, for the vaunted English longbowmen were for once ineffective. The men in the front ranks of the Scottish formations were well armoured, and as one chronicler remarked, they were most assuredly harnessed and abode the most dangerous shot of arrows, which sore annoyed them. Yet except it hit them in some bare place, did them no hurt. Furthermore, many of the archers found their bowstrings had become damp, and their bows were therefore less effective. Yet the same showers which wet the bowstrings also proved the Scots' undoing. Lands-Connacht tactics were brutally direct. Once they were committed to action, the front ranks levelled their pikes shoulder high and moved forward as fast as the ground would allow. It was rare for their pikeheads to actually penetrate the armour and thick protective clothing worn by the opposing infantry. But what they aimed to do was, quite literally, knock them over by sheer impetus. Once the enemy were down, pikes would be discarded and swords used to finish off the now helpless men as they struggled to rise and flee. To do this, however, required a firm grip underfoot, speed, and perfect discipline. All three were lacking at Flodden. In the first place, even though many Scots had taken their boots off, the wet grass made the steep slope treacherously slippery, and then a slight boggy dip immediately in front of Surrey's position combined with this to prevent the Scots coming forward at the steady trot favoured by the lanzknechts. A lack of discipline and the effects of Appleyard's artillery fire also tended to break up the Scots' formations, lessening the eventual impact still further. Consequently, when the King's division actually came into collision with Surrey's stationary men, the English kept their footing and held their ground. The long pikes were now useless, and the Scots quickly discarded them and took to their swords, but they were at a terrible disadvantage against the English bills. Then Bothwell brought his reserve brigade down the hill and into the melee, seemingly without affecting the outcome. It seems he may simply have fed his men into the already stationary mass. Nevertheless, a brutal fight ensued, in which neither side gave nor asked for quarter. The Scots leaders were so well armoured that not only were they virtually impervious to arrows, but they were such large and stout men that one witness commented they did not fall even when struck by 4 or 5 bills. Unlike Bothwell's ineffectual intervention in the centre, the English admiral's action was to prove decisive. Having reorganised his division after their victory over Errol's men, he turned and crashed into the flank and rear of the King's division. The arrival of this new force seems to have decided the issue in the centre, and Scots' resistance collapsed. Most of the lightly equipped soldiers in the rear of the columns probably made their way back up the hill without too much difficulty, but there was no escape for the heavily armoured leaders in the front ranks. Amongst those who died was King James himself. Trying to cut his way through to meet Surrey, he had his helmet beaten off, was wounded in the face by an arrow, and finally hacked to death by an unknown billman. A less than chivalrous end for a king who would only expect to be dispatched by an equal. But in the heat of the fury, few could yet know the fate of the king. Up on Brankston Hill, one last Scots division remained to be committed. The Highlanders, led by Lennox and Argyle. For some reason, they had remained on the hill throughout the battle. James may have neglected to give them any orders, or more probably perhaps, because they had little armour and no pikes, he all along intended them to remain in reserve. At any rate, seeing the King's division in trouble, they had just started to move down the slope in order to cover its retreat when they were hit in the flank by an English brigade led by Sir Edward Stanley. Scrambling up the side of the hill unseen, Stanley's archers poured a hasty volley into the unsuspecting Highlanders. The result was devastating. Lennox and Argyle were both killed. The Highlanders made a half-hearted attempt to counter-attack, but were then driven pell-mell down the hill and across the ground where the King's division had just been beaten. Surrey's men were in no condition to intercept them, however, and the survivors got clean away when their pursuers fell to plundering the dead. Night was falling by now, and both armies wearily withdrew to their original positions. Surrey, falling back on Barmore, knew that he had won the battle, and may even have known that the King of the Scots was dead. But neither he nor his army were in any condition to finish the job by taking on Hume and Huntley's unbeaten brigades. Surrey's victory had been dearly bought, and if his payrolls are reliable, some 1,500 of his men died at Flodden, besides as many more who had run away when the right wing collapsed. Furthermore, the survivors who had marched all day and fought well into the night were still desperately short of supplies, and when they reached Barmore village, they were disgusted to find their own camp plundered by those men who had earlier run away. Up on Brankston Hill, surrounded by the dead and wounded, Hume and Huntley spent a still more sombre night. Although they had won their own fight and held their brigades together, it was obvious that disaster had overwhelmed the rest of the army. As the shocked survivors assembled in the darkness, the full extent of that disaster gradually became apparent. In the thin light of dawn, the Scots came down off the hill once more, but this time, abandoning their camp and most of their artillery, they retreated northwards, back across the Tweed and into Scotland. Behind them, they left upwards of 3,000 dead, including their king, 8 earls, and 13 barons. Nearly every nobleman who had followed him down that fatal slope. A whole generation of the country's leaders had been wiped out. There was scarce a family in Scotland not touched by the tragedy. One man had 7 sons slain at Flodden. As they awaited news in Edinburgh, a terrible wailing rose from the streets as the women's folk looked for a sign of departed sons and husbands. So terrible were their cries that a proclamation was passed which read, "All women are to pass to their labours, and not be seen upon the gate, clamouring and crying, under pain of banishment from the city." In her palace at Linlithgow, Queen Margaret and her infant son waited for news in the high tower which to this day has been known as Queen Margaret's Tower. Eventually, a worn-out messenger arrived in Edinburgh, nearly dead with fatigue. He carried the terrible news. "The king is slain, and with him the flower of Scotland."
Early on the morning of the 16th of April, 1746, a British army began striking camp at Nairn in the north of Scotland. Ahead of it lay a crucial battle, not against a foreign foe, but against a rebellious army which threatened to wreck the fragile union between Scotland and England and to strangle the British Empire at birth. One of the protagonists in this struggle was William, Duke of Cumberland, second son of George II. The other was his cousin, the young pretender, Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. They were to meet on Culloden Moor. A terrible defeat of the Highland clans at Culloden Moor is all too often seen simply as a battle between the Scots and the English, or even as the dramatic death throes of the old Gaelic world. In fact, it was no more than the last great act in the fall of the royal house of Stuart, a sad and bloody tragedy which brought pain and suffering to every corner of the British Isles. If we are really to understand why British troops came to fight a Highland army on a barren stretch of moorland outside Inverness, we must go back more than 100 years to the Great Civil War in the reign of the first Charles Stuart, Charles I, the great-grandfather of Bonnie Prince Charlie. The House of Stuart became the first dynasty to sit upon the combined throne of the two kingdoms of Scotland and England, when James VI of Scotland and First of England succeeded a childless Elizabeth I to the throne in 1603. James was canny enough to avoid alienating his people, but his son Charles mismanaged his rule to such an extent that a civil war resulted, which led Charles to his execution in 1649. Britain's only military dictatorship, headed by Oliver Cromwell, followed. And despite the fact that Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, The sacred chains of absolute monarchy were broken. The divine right of kings had been challenged, and this truth was apparent to all. A sovereign now ruled only by the consent of his people. With the overthrow of Charles I, the people had removed one unsuitable ruler. In 1688, they were to do it again. Within 3 short years of his ascent to the throne, the second son of Charles I, James II, had alienated his people as surely as his father had done at the time of the English Civil War. James was a convert to Catholicism, a religion which most Britons loathed with a passion which is not easy for our modern, more secular society to understand. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Church enjoyed far more influence than it does today, and consequently, the form and manner of worship was far more important to ordinary people. Scotland and England were both overwhelmingly Protestant. The older Catholic religion survived in only small pockets in the north of England and around the Gaelic fringes of Scotland and Ireland. Catholics in general were feared and distrusted, and a Catholic king was therefore regarded with great suspicion. At first, James was tolerated by the people, but in 1688, the birth of a Catholic son and heir caused the crisis which saw him toppled in the bloodless series of events known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688. James II was replaced by his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. But from his exile in France, James plotted to regain the throne. Support for the return of a Catholic monarch was non-existent in most of Britain, so James raised his standard in Catholic Ireland and called for a simultaneous uprising in Scotland. This rising was to lead to the battles of Killiecrankie and the Boyne. Today, the events of the Boyne still shape the face of politics in Northern Ireland, but their immediate effect was to send the defeated King James back into exile, this time for good. With his death in 1701, the claim to the throne passed to his son, also named James, who would have become James III, but was to become better known to posterity as the Old Pretender. The young James grew restless as he watched the unfavourable events in Britain from his exile in France. The successor to William and Mary, Queen Anne, died in 1714, and Parliament offered the crown to George, Elector of Hanover, a staunch Protestant. The change of dynasty further weakened the Stuart cause, but it was not universally popular. And many government opponents were drawn towards the Jacobite camp, which came to be viewed as the natural party of opposition. Sensing the time to be right, the Pretender too pinned his hopes of regaining his throne on the Celtic fringes of Britain. In 1715, the Scottish clans obligingly rose in arms once again, at this time in support of the man who would have been James III. The Jacobite rebellion of 715, however, fared no better than James II's ill-fated attempt in 1689. Popular support was low, and after the indecisive Battle of Sheriffmuir, the rebellion dwindled away. Arriving in Scotland only after the battle had been fought, James quickly fled back into exile. Were it not for the blood which was spilt, the story of the next Jacobite rising would contain more than a little element of farce. In 1719, another attempt by the Pretender to regain his throne by rising in Scotland failed even more ignominiously. This time, Spanish help had been enlisted, but the main Spanish invasion fleet was scattered by a great storm, and the rising of 1719 ended in a half-hearted battle at Glenshiel. By any sensible reckoning, the pretensions of the Stuarts to the throne of Britain should now have been dead and buried. They had made 3 full-blooded attempts, all of which were failures. But there was still one last act to be played in the tragedy. In 1743, Britain and France became embroiled in yet another major war. Despite all their previous experiences, the Jacobites had long been planning another rising. This time, the French agreed to help, seeking to destabilize Britain at home. Now nearly 60 years of age, the old pretender sensibly passed up the prospect of a further forlorn attempt at a prize which was obviously well beyond his reach. However, French military help was promised. So his son, the 25-year-old Prince Charles, with the rashness of youth, was prepared to stake everything on one last throw of the dice. In an eerie echo of the storm which had wrecked the Spanish fleet gathered to support his father in 1719, a second storm now wrecked the French invasion fleet, which had been assembled to assist the prince's cause in 1744. But Charles Edward Stuart was clearly no respecter of omens, and undaunted by the loss of his fleet, he decided to carry on and lead an uprising without substantial French military help.
The basic problem for the whole of the Bonnie Prince Charles's cause in the 45 was a lack of popular support he received in Scotland, above all. It is not always realised only 6 clans actually rallied to him. The rest either stayed passive or rallied to the government. And when he got down into England, it was much the same. Although there were plenty of Jacobite sympathisers in England, except at Manchester, there was no sign of real rallying to his cause. So it is that the failure to really inspire a widespread movement, I think, made it impossible for him to win in the long term. Bonnie Prince Charlie, of course, inherited certain traits from his ancestors. Both Charles I and James II, for example, were absolutely pig-headed and stubborn as mules. And I think we have to say that Bonnie Prince Charlie was that as well, at several times in this adventure. The other side of the coin is, of course, that the King George II was very popular at this period. He'd been the last King of England ever to serve on the battlefield at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. He spoke English, which his father, George I, had never done, and there's no doubt he was a popular monarch. So once again, there was no appeal against an unpopular foreign ruler to be background for the Jacobite cause.
Charles and a handful of companions sailed in just 2 ships, but yet more ill luck followed in his wake. 100 miles west of Cornwall, they were intercepted by HMS Lion. In a 5-hour battle, the Lion and the larger of Charles' 2 ships, the Elizabeth, were reduced to little more than floating wrecks. Needless to say, the Elizabeth carried the bulk of the arms for the planned rising. As she limped back to a French harbour, the young pretender must have felt more exposed than ever. If his resolve was tested by the loss of the Elizabeth and her vital cargo, it was strained to breaking point by his reception in Scotland. Landing with only 7 companions at Arisaig, on the west coast of Scotland, the prince did not give the appearance of a man about to lead a triumphant crusade. The clan chiefs had agreed to support a rising in the belief that they would be assisting an invasion by French regular troops. In fact, the prince had landed amongst them without a single French grenadier at his back. Now that it was obvious that the entire burden of the venture would fall upon the Highland clans, a number of the most influential chiefs wisely withdrew their support. A shrewder man might have abandoned the scheme at that point, but undaunted and with the flawed judgment which typified the House of Stuart, the young pretender soldiered on. Here at Glenfinnan, on the 19th of August 1745, his standard was raised, more in hope than expectation. Much against their better judgment, Cameron of Lochiel and the MacDonalds of Glengarry, Keppoch and Clanranald brought in their followers. The 45 had begun. Once raised, this small army marched on Edinburgh. As they marched southwards, additional numbers came in, and one of those who joined them was an Edinburgh merchant's son, a well-connected man named James Johnson.
As soon as the news of the Prince's landing was confirmed at Edinburgh, I immediately repaired to the house of Lord Rollo, the father-in-law of my sister, there to await the arrival of the Prince at Perth. And on the 6th of September I left it, accompanied by the 2 Misses Rollo, who presented me to their relations, the Duke of Perth and Lord George Murray. On my arrival, I was greatly surprised to find so few followers with the Prince, as public report at Edinburgh had increased them to a prodigious number. The Prince appointed Lord George and the Duke of Perth as his lieutenant generals. Lord George proposed that I should be his aide-de-camp, which proposal I accepted and began immediately to enter on the exercise of the duties attached to the situation. Night and day my occupations were incessant, and I could scarcely find the time to sleep 2 hours in the 24.
The Jacobites whom Johnson joined were often referred to as the Highland Army, and the majority of them wore Highland clothes, whether they spoke the Gaelic or not. Most Highlanders joined in the rebellion because they had been ordered to do so by their clan chiefs. Some came willingly, but others had to be forced out under the threat of having their homes burnt and their cattle taken. A clan chief exercised a frightening authority over his tenants and followers. He expected, and usually got, absolute obedience. One of those forced out was a carpenter from near Drumnadrochit, named Andrew Urquhart, who later gave this testimony at his trial.
Master Hoshi Cogich Culloden, and ik dol ni go laslach Gary. Agus ní sé go dúne Glen Urquhart, gus in nígach iad cólarish a habos gan a Francia, and ik fugin Jonach, ag va tor nach roch, is on grauch a gau rish a Kionark, gelaf lach Gary roke you. Hunig me dúne gur hoorder fallaf, agus a gra gummiarlach bas a huich. Naïve a hoort stiach gianna Kionark, hure bule, was stocken gunna an log hon talave, agus lon falla.
At first, the Jacobites could muster only some 1,200 men, but their support was growing. The commander of the British troops in Scotland, General Sir John Cope, therefore took a difficult decision. He had two choices. Either he could stand fast and defend the line of the Forth, as the Duke of Argyll had done against the Jacobites in 1715, or he could march into the Highlands to nip the rebellion in the bud, as General Whiteman had done in 1719. The first option was out of the question. It meant abandoning most of Scotland to the Jacobites, and the rising might then take months to suppress. Cope therefore marched northwards, hoping to enlist the support of the Protestant Highland clans, who were sympathetic to the government. To his dismay, he found none of the pro-government clans were willing to support him. Although the vast majority of the Scottish population were opposed to the Jacobites, they were indifferent in the matter of actually taking up arms against them. So with the Jacobites rapidly gaining strength, Cope was forced to turn aside rather than risk a battle. He therefore made for Aberdeen. With Cope out of the way, the road to the south now lay open, and the Jacobites raced southwards to Edinburgh, which they captured on the 17th of September. Edinburgh had once been known as the Geneva of the North, and one English observer, a member of the Privy Council, named Stephen Poyntz, commented upon its fall with some astonishment. That a nation like Scotland, which makes a strict profession of the Protestant religion and values itself on respecting the sanctity of an oath, should suffer the pretender's son with a handful of rabble to walk the Protestant succession out of the kingdom without lifting up a single weapon or hand against him, is astonishing to the last degree, and fills one with dreadful apprehension for the behaviour of England. Had the town of Edinburgh made good the profession of their address, they might easily have destroyed such an undisciplined crew from the windows of their high stone houses. But how far it may now be in Sir John Cope's power to dislodge them, or how far it may be practicable for him with his handful of men to engage them now they are strengthened, I tremble to think. Relatively few of the Highlanders who occupied Edinburgh actually carried the broadswords and targes with which they are usually depicted. Broadswords were expensive, and generally speaking, only the Highland gentlemen in the front ranks carried them. The first Jacobite forces were very makeshift in character. Patrick Crichton and Edinburgh Burgess recall the Jacobites. whom he had seen during the occupation of Edinburgh.
I entered the town by the Bristol port, which I saw to my indignation in the keeping of these caterpillars. A boy stood with a rusty drawn sword, and two fellows with things like guns of the 16th century sat on each side of the entry to the poorhouse, and these were catching the vermin from the lurking places about their plaids and throwing them away. I said to Mr. Jardine, Minister of Liberton, "Are these the scoundrels who have surprised Edinburgh by treachery?" He answered, "I'd rather seen it in the hands of Frenchmen, but the devil and the deep sea are both as bad." The officers with their troops in rank and file marched from the Parliament Close down to the cross with their bagpipes and their lousy crew, and they made a circle around it. I observed their arms. There were guns of different sizes, and some of enormous length, some with butts turned up like a herring's tail, some tied with pack-thread to the stock, and some matchlocks. Some had swords instead of guns, one or two had pitchforks, and some bits of scythes upon pole with a hook, and some old Lochaber axes.
As the Jacobites settled down to the occupation of the capital, General Cope had meanwhile found enough shipping to take his army south by sea. He had hoped to retake Edinburgh, but instead his troops were surprised and routed by the Highland army in less than 10 minutes at the Battle of Prestonpans, early on the morning of the 21st of September, 1745. Scotland was now secure, and Charles' father was proclaimed James VIII of Scotland. But at this moment of triumph, the first signs of dissent began to appear in the ranks of the Highland army. They had won Scotland for the Stuarts, and many felt they had discharged their obligation to the prince, and accordingly quit the ranks to head home. However, Charles Edward Stuart had his sights firmly set on the English throne as well. Still unsupported by French troops, he viewed his Highland army as the only option for regaining that throne too. But even the prince himself must have suspected its unsuitability for the job. Nonetheless, the news of the easy victory at Prestonpans swelled the Jacobite ranks, and within a month, the Jacobite army mustered over 5,000 men. Against the express wishes of many of the Highland chiefs, on the 1st of November 1745, Edinburgh was abandoned, and the invasion of England began. The invasion progressed rapidly, and the Jacobites were soon in control of Manchester. The youthful Duke of Cumberland, with a substantial field army, tried to intercept the Jacobites near Lichfield, but they slipped by him, and by the 4th of December were at Derby, only 127 miles from London. Panic swept the capital, and there was a run on the Bank of England. The mood of desperation and spreading terror was captured by Hogarth in this famous scene. Londoners may have been terrified, but the French were delighted with the news from England. Hasty orders were given to mount a force to send across the Channel to assist the Jacobites. However, some French generals argued that the troops should go to Flanders to fight the British army there instead. Although some French regulars would ultimately be sent to help the Jacobites, they would not arrive for some time. While the French prevaricated, the Jacobite army halted at Derby. There, the young pretender and his officers argued for 2 days about what to do next. Charles was for pushing on to London, but the others disagreed. They pointed out that the French had still not landed, and that, crucially, there was no sign of real support from the English population. A rational man could see that they could not possibly hope to capture London, a city of 1 million inhabitants with just 5,000 men. In the end, Charles had to accept their decision. But he evermore considered himself betrayed by the Highlanders, and increasingly relied upon his Irish Quartermaster General, John William O'Sullivan, in preference to the Highland chiefs, represented by Lord George Murray.
The problems of the Highland High Command really split down into two. First of all, there was the prince himself. Although he had a fairly high idea of his abilities, got totally from reading books, I might say, as a soldier. In fact, he'd never been on any active service at all in his life. He'd once attended, as a young teenager, a siege on the continent as a spectator, but he really believed that streak of Stuart stubbornness that he knew it all, and therefore he did not need all that much guidance. But the second problem, which compounded the first one, was the fact that his staff, if we can call it that, in his entourage, were divided into two warring parties, which were daggers drawn with one another. On the one side, there was Lord George Murray, who was by far the most able soldier in the Jacobite entourage. And then there was, of course, O'Sullivan, the famous quartermaster general of the army, who in the end Prince Charles decided to favour, because he talks more and more from Derby onwards about treachery, how he's being betrayed by both the English and, above all, the Scots, not rising in big enough numbers. So he tended to swing behind this rather inadequate person who was not a good quartermaster general, never mind a strategist, who was, of course, an exile like he had been himself. As Napoleon would say, a generation and more later, better one bad general than two good ones. And this division of command, therefore, within the army of the Bonnie Prince Charlie, was a fatal complication.
With the fateful decision to turn north, although few could have known it, the Jacobite cause had reached its high water mark. On the 6th of December, the army turned around and began retreating northwards. Still expecting the Jacobites to move on London, Cumberland had planned to fight them near Coventry, and he was taken completely by surprise by the sudden change of direction. So the Highland army had almost reached Scotland before he managed to re-establish contact. But just as Cumberland reached the Jacobite forces, a false report of a French invasion sent him scurrying southwards toward London again. Unhindered for the moment, the Jacobites made for Glasgow, and there laid siege to Stirling Castle. General Henry Hawley attempted to relieve the garrison, but he was defeated in a hard-fought battle outside Falkirk on the 17th of January. Despite the fact that it is normally regarded as a Jacobite victory, the Battle of Falkirk nonetheless gave the Jacobites something of a fright. While most of Hawley's army ran away, some government regiments, for the first time in the rebellion, stood firm against the Highlanders, who faltered in the face of their resistance. By now, a small contingent of French regulars had finally arrived in Scotland to assist the Jacobites, and it was this detachment which saw off the government troops and thus won the battle for Charles. Unfortunately, these were the only French troops to be sent to assist the 45. The French invasion had again been called off, and the Duke of Cumberland hurried north again to take over Hawley's defeated army. His arrival was received with great enthusiasm. In the name of his father, King George II, he set out to destroy the Jacobites once and for all. All of the predictions that the Rising was bound to fail without French help were now coming true. Rather than risk another battle, the prince bowed to pressure from the Highland chiefs, and the Jacobites retreated northwards to Inverness. Cumberland pursued them slowly, halting for a month at Aberdeen. But on the 8th of April, he left the borough, and within 6 days was at Nairn, only a few miles short of the Jacobite headquarters at Inverness. The speed of Cumberland's sudden advance caught the Jacobites by surprise. Although many of their best men were away, there was no real option left but to fight. So on the morning of the 14th of April, 1746, they marched out from Inverness, prepared to take up their battle positions on Culloden Moor. But the government army did not appear that day, nor the next. The 15th of April was Cumberland's birthday, and to celebrate, he gave his army a day's rest at Nairn, before committing them to the battle on the 16th. On the 15th of April, while the Jacobites waited in vain for the British army to advance, they hatched a desperate plan. The Jacobite leaders supposed that as his men were celebrating the Duke's birthday, they were likely, as Lord George put it, to be drunk as beggars. They therefore agreed the ill-fated plan to secretly advance on Cumberland's army by night and mount a dawn attack on the sleeping camp. This was to result in the infamous all-night march, which preceded the Battle of Culloden. About 8 p.m. on the night of April the 15th, the whole Jacobite army set off, hoping to surprise the government camp at Nairn, 8 miles distant. But by the first light, they were still 2 miles short of their objective, and it was clear that the British army would be ready and waiting for them in broad daylight. Lord George Murray therefore abandoned the attempt and ordered his men back to Culloden. The prince was furious, but there was nothing to be done. After a night spent blundering around in the darkness, all that had been achieved was to exhaust his men on the eve of their greatest trial. Worse still, the Jacobites' makeshift supply system couldn't provide food for the returning army. Dispirited, tired and hungry, large numbers wandered off in the vain hope of finding some food, while others simply sought to sleep. For many, it would be their last.
Exhausted with hunger and worn out with the fatigue of the last 3 nights, I turned off as fast as I could to Inverness, there to recruit my strength with a little sleep. But when I already had one leg in the bed and was on the point of stretching myself between the sheets, what was my surprise to hear the drumbeat to arms and the trumpet sounding the call to boot and saddle. I hurried on my clothes, my eyes half shut, and mounting a horse instantly repaired to our army on the eminence where we had remained for 3 days, and from which we saw the British army at a distance of 2 miles, in movement towards us.
The battlefield, upon which the two armies faced each other, was a broad ridge of moorland, 5 miles to the southeast of Inverness. The Jacobites took up position between 2 sets of wall parks. On their right, the Culwiniag Park, stretching down to the river, and on their left, the walls of the Culloden Parks. The moor to their front was flat and open, ideal for the fearsome Highland charge, which had brought victory at Prestonpans and Falkirk. By the time of Culloden, the Highland army was more conventionally equipped, and most had French muskets and bayonets, though the front rank still kept their swords and targes. The Highland method of fighting, however, was still very different from that of the red-coated regulars opposite. They had neither the training nor, indeed, sufficient ammunition to engage in protracted exchanges of musket fire. Instead, led by the swordsmen in the front ranks, they came down to within musket shot, fired a single volley, and then ran in with sword and shield, hoping to induce panic in the enemy ranks. This was the famous Highland charge.
A Highland charge is usually seen as a bunch of men in kilts bounding over the heather, waving swords, axes and all sorts of wonderful things, which they then proceed to literally carve the opposition apart. In actual fact, it didn't really work that way. It worked on panic. They'd come hurtling down, great big mob, and literally frighten the living daylights out of the enemy, who'd promptly turn on their way and then die in the hundreds, tens of hundreds, and so on and so forth. This worked well at Prestonpans, didn't work quite so well at Falkirk, but at Culloden it all went wrong, mainly because it's so far to come. There were 500 yards there, and all the time they're being fired on, first by cannon firing round shot, then grape shot, then muskets. The redcoats saw them coming, they had time, they stood their ground, and although the Highlanders did break in on the right flank, really it hadn't worked. The main tactic of frightening the opposition hadn't worked, and the bayonets in the end won the battle.
Behind the Highland regiments, in the front rank of the Jacobite army, stood a second line of Lowland Scotch regiments, stiffened by 2 regiments of French regulars. One was called the Irish Pickets, and the other was the blue-jacketed Royal Écossais, or Royal Scots. Many of the men serving in both these regiments were deserters from the British army, and would face summary justice after the battle. All in all, The Jacobites ought to have mustered some 6,500 infantry. In addition, there were a smaller number of cavalrymen and gunners. Unfortunately, far too many of the Highlanders had straggled off in search of food and shelter, and the Jacobite army probably amounted to little more than 4,000 infantry on the field that day. In front of the Jacobite line were placed 11 3-pounder cannon, and it was these ill-fated guns which would signal the commencement of the battle. On the other side of the moor, Cumberland had some 6,500 infantry drawn up in 2 lines. He also had a regiment of government Highlanders, the Argyll militia, together with 14 troops of mounted dragoons on his flanks. Unlike the civilians manning the cannon of the Jacobites, all of Cumberland's artillerymen were well-trained professionals who handled the guns with deadly efficiency. At this period, firepower normally decided the outcome of regular battles, but sometimes it was not enough, and the soldier then had to turn to his bayonet, which was a fearsome weapon. Utilising the lessons from Prestonpans and Falkirk, at Culloden, a departure on the normal bayonet drill was used. Instead of lunging straight forward at the man in front of him, who would be protected by his shield, each soldier was trained to thrust instead at the swordsman attacking the man on his right. By doing this, he would have a clean thrust at the unprotected right-hand side of the Highlander. This new drill was to prove itself deadly effective in a very few short hours. The British Army, which was to fight on Culloden Moor, is often pictured as being composed of the very dregs of society, led by aristocratic officers who despise their men. In actual fact, it was in many ways surprisingly similar to the modern British Army. The rank and file took a fierce pride in their regiments, and their officers were dedicated professional soldiers. There were, however, some men who were not there by choice, known as vestrymen. They were petty criminals delivered up by their parishers to serve until the end of the rebellion. Unwanted and ill-disciplined, they were to play a sinister role after the battle. But there were as many honest men in the ranks, a very high proportion of them Scots. Standing in the British front line was a Royal Scots Fusilier named Edward Lynn. Afterwards, he wrote to his wife, telling her what he saw that day.
We waded up to our knees in glass through the mere with a good well to be at him, and nae wonder considering we've been through this winter. Afore we engaged it rained half a sair, both hail and rain, the strong wind were backs, but just then they began to fire their big guns, it grew into an half a fine like day. Then the Duke rode through our front line just afore we begun, and desired us all nae to be feared of her. Depend, my lads, on your bayonets, says he. Let them ken the men they hae to deal with. Aye, well, we did.
Sometime around midday, one of Cumberland's staff officers, Lord Bury, rode forward to count the Jacobite guns and was fired on by 2 of them. The government artillery fired back, and the battle was begun. The ill-served Jacobite guns were soon silenced, and for as long as the Highlanders stood their ground, the government artillery kept up a steady rhythm of 1 round a minute with the 10 guns. No one knows how long the Highlanders stood facing the bombardment. It could have been for as little as 10 minutes or as many as 20. But they had to endure it because hundreds of men were still hurrying to the moor to rejoin their regiments. This delay was exacerbated by the unwillingness of the prince to give the order to attack. The Jacobite commanders hoped to delay their charge until as many of the men as possible had rejoined their colours. But although the effects of the government artillery were galling to the Jacobites, it was to be General Hawley's dragoons and the government Highlanders who eventually forced their hand and precipitated the Highland charge.
One of the big stories about Culloden is the fact the Highlanders stood for so long being fired on by the government artillery. In some accounts it suggested most of the Highlanders died up on the back on the ridge there, where the red flag is, fired on by the government artillery, while
Bonnie Prince Charlie sat dithering, wondering what to do. In fact, this was not really a problem. It was if you got hit by a cannonball, of course, but in military terms, the cannonade was not very effective. The guns were knocking over an average about one man with every shot fired. They had 10 guns, each one firing about once a minute. With a cannonade lasting only about a quarter of an hour, that's not killing very many Jacobites. Where the killing really started was once they got down close to the government line, and the artillerymen switched from firing cannonballs to firing grape shot, which is effectively a bag full of musket balls, worked like a shotgun. Now that did kill people.
As the Jacobite army stood immobile, awaiting the order to charge, General Hawley ordered his 4 companies of Argyllshire Highlanders to break down the walls in the enclosure on the Jacobite right flank, in order to let the dragoons through to attack them. Soon, he was threatening the right flank and rear of the Jacobite army. A brief respite was gained for the Jacobites when Lord Lewis Gordon's 2 Lowland battalions from Aberdeen swung around to face the approaching dragoons. But faced with this threat, the order was given for a general assault on Cumberland's position while there was still time.
What is not always realised is how multinational both of the armies at the battlefield of Culloden were. Take, for example, Bonnie Prince Charlie's army. He had Irish, he had Frenchmen present. And of course he had a few lowland troops, although the great majority of the Scots were Highlanders, of course, from the clans. Strangely enough, you get exactly the same social or national mixture of forces within the army of Cumberland, the Royal Army. Of the 16 regiments which made up the bulk of Cumberland's army, no less than 4, or 1 man in 4, a quarter, were in fact Scottish regiments.
Despite the cosmopolitan makeup of the Jacobite army, the principal tactic was still the Highland charge. Over the past 100 years, yelling mobs of clansmen had inspired fear and panic amongst regular troops on a score of battlefields. But at Culloden, it was to prove a disastrous failure. The moor was not as featureless as it might at first have appeared. The Inverness Road ran diagonally across it from the bottom corner of the Culloden Park to O'Learnach, and the ground between the road and the British Army was wet and boggy. The armies were drawn up 500 yards apart, a comparatively long distance to charge over, especially over difficult terrain. As the Jacobites set off towards the British lines, the Highland left, made up of MacDonald's regiments, blundered into the morass, while those in the centre desperately tried to avoid it by swinging to their right. Unfortunately, they had once collided with Lord George Murray's right wing, which was itself veering to the left in order to avoid the Learnach enclosure wall. For a moment, they were all brought to a confused halt, and Cumberland's gunners, switching from round shot to canister, lacerated the stationary jumble of men with hundreds of musket balls. After this pause, the Camerons and Macintoshes led the Jacobites on again, so that the whole weight of the attack fell upon just 1 battalion, Barrow's 4th of Foot, now the King's Own Royal Border Regiment. The men of Barrow's battalion fought back savagely, but were overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers, losing 1 of their colours and nearly a third of their strength in killed and wounded. However, 2 regiments from the government's second line were ordered by a watchful Cumberland to march up to attack the Jacobite flank, while 2 more, including Sempill Scott's borderers, engaged them from the front. The Jacobites were brought to a halt for a second time, jammed in a dense column that was estimated by contemporary accounts to be as many as 20 or 30 men deep. Those at the front had already fired or thrown away their muskets. Now they could only reply with pistols or even with stones. Some were even shot down from behind by their own men further back in the column. There was now ranged around them some 1,700 well-drilled soldiers who proceeded to fire 5 or 6 volleys into the column at point-blank range. In the space of just 2 terrible minutes, 800 clansmen were killed or wounded, and the macabre outline of that massive column can still be traced today in the great slough of graves, stretching southwards from the Well of Dead on Culloden Moor. Such merciless slaughter could not continue. Faced with those terrible point-blank volleys of musketry, some Jacobites began surrendering, but most of the survivors turned and ran back across the moor. On the other flank of the Highland army, the MacDonalds struggled to within 20 yards of Cumberland's men, but then the relentless musket fire of the Royal Scots and 13th Foot brought them to a complete halt. Not one of the MacDonalds even reached the British line. Then, seeing the rest of the Highlanders falling back, the MacDonald men ran too, and Captain Johnson went with them.
We were on the left of our army, and at the distance of about 20 paces when the rout began to become general. In a rage, I discharged my blunderbuss and pistols at the enemy, and immediately endeavoured to save myself like the rest. But having charged on foot and in boots, I was so overcome by the marshy ground that instead of running, I could scarcely walk. All at once, I perceived a horse without a rider, about 30 paces before me. I ran and laid hold of the bridle, which was held fast in the hand of a man lying on the ground, whom I supposed dead. What was my surprise when the cowardly poltroon dared to dispute the horse with me? Fortunately, Finlay Cameron, an officer in Lochiel's regiment, happened to pass near us. I called on him to assist me, and he immediately placed his pistol at the head of the man and threatened to blow out his brains. The fellow, who had the look of a servant, at once yielded the horse and took to his heels.
The Highland regiments in the Jacobite army had been routed, but the Battle of Culloden was still far from over. The Lowland units standing in the second line were rather a mixed bag, but there were some good regiments among them, and as the Highlanders came running back, a desperate fight began to protect their retreat. General Hawley's dragoons and the Highlanders of the Argyll militia were pushing into the Jacobite rear, threatening to encircle them. But James Moore, of Stonywood's Aberdeen regiment, played a major role in keeping the government cavalry at bay. It was about this time that the Pretender himself made his escape. Lord Elcho, the leader of his own bodyguard, called bitterly after him, "Run, you cowardly Italian!" With Elcho's cry ringing in his ears, he rode off the field with a small escort of French cavalry to look to his own destiny. The prince had spent most of the battle far in the rear, and now he was only intent on escaping to France as soon as possible. His followers were ungraciously ordered to fend for themselves. Even with the prince gone, and the Highland regiment scattered, the remnants of the last Jacobite army continued its final death struggle. And in one of history's sad little ironies, the Scots soldiers of the French Royal Écossais in the Jacobite ranks exchanged fire for a time with the British Royal Scots of the government army. The brave actions of the Royal Écossais gave the fleeing MacDonalds the brief respite they needed to escape. But as government troops arrived, they were soon surrounded by cavalry, and after a fierce fight, which left half of them dead or wounded, they laid down their arms, surrendering as prisoners of war. Once the Royal Écossais had surrendered, there was nothing left to restrain the dragoons, and they mercilessly rode down the Jacobite fugitives. An indiscriminate slaughter of the fleeing men and women and children who followed in the wake of the army began, and continued all the way into Inverness. No mercy was shown in respect of age or sex, and many innocent civilians were brutally murdered in the ensuing bloodshed. Back on the field, the battle was now over, and Cumberland marched his infantry forward across the moor to stand on the ground formerly occupied by the Jacobites. By this symbolic act, he formally claimed his victory. Edward Glynn remembered the desperate events of the day.
It was a wee bit after 12 o'clock when the battle begun, and then by 1 o'clock it was all finished like. The Jacobites come up half a bold like in a muckle great bourachie. They had their swords in their hands, but we girdled them as like a warm like volley and kept blazing away continuous with firelocks and with canister. They pretty soon retreated back again faster than they come. Then were dragoons that was in their right and left wings pursued with sword and pistol and cutting off a mony of them down. And they were so packed thick as we did in yon place. We lost half a few men to our regiment, only a puckle wounded like. In fact, the army lost nae mair than about 1,200 killed and wounded altogether. We never had such good luck as this afore, and I thank God for it.
In all, the British Army lost a total of 50 killed at Culloden. On the other hand, something like 1,500 Jacobites were slain on the field, or cut down on the road to Inverness. Hundreds more of the Jacobite wounded were taken prisoner, and by evening, on the 16th of April, the British Army had no fewer than 326 Jacobite prisoners in its charge at Inverness, besides the 229 French regulars. Many of the Jacobites, wrote one officer, were desperately wounded. Indeed, over the next few days, the number of prisoners rose dramatically as the wounded Jacobites were brought in from the moor and fleeing fugitives were captured. Many of their later complaints about bad treatment alleged that wounds were left unattended. History has coloured the aftermath of Culloden as a savage frenzy of killing by an out-of-control government army. In fact, there was no systematic massacre of wounded men on the field directly after the battle. But a series of barbaric atrocities were undoubtedly committed in the days that followed by small groups and squads of government soldiers under the direction of their officers. There was an ugly rumour that the Jacobites had themselves ordered that no prisoners were to be taken if Culloden was a Jacobite victory. Cumberland himself referred to it in orders he issued, and this ensured that there was no sympathy for the wounded Jacobites still on the moor, and many of whom were killed in a barbarous fashion. Those Jacobites who were captured fared little better. They were guarded by the despised vestrymen, an unsavoury collection of petty offenders and other undesirables foisted upon the army by parish constables. It would be hard to find a worse or more brutal set of jailers. It was they who were responsible for many of the acts of cruelty and murder which followed Culloden. In the months which followed, many Jacobites were tried and executed, while hundreds more were transported to the American colonies, or, most ironic of all, conscripted into the British Army. Inevitably, for a man pledged to break the power of the clans forever, Cumberland's pacification of the Highlands was heavy-handed and brutal. The innocent suffered with the guilty, but the punitive expeditions served their purpose. The clans refused ever to rise in arms again. If there is a single shaft of redeeming light from the terrible aftermath of Culloden, it was this. Despite the vicious and inhuman excesses of the clearances, Scotland was spared forever the horror of another series of increasingly pointless rebellions. Most Scots of the time, like Edward Lynn and Patrick Crichton, thanked God for it.
We, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the noblemen, gentlemen, and freeholders of the Shire of Edinburgh, beg leave, with our hearts full of joy, to congratulate your Majesty on the victory obtained by His Royal Highness, the Duke of Cumberland, over the Jacobites on the 16th of April. The evils we felt during this wicked, unnatural, and unprovoked rebellion, and the more dreadful evils we had reason to fear if it should prevail, the imminent danger we were in of being robbed of our religion, laws, liberties, and properties, the complete overthrow of the Jacobites by the bravery of your own troops under the command of your heroic son, and the safety of his great life in the heat of action, all make this a glorious victory.